Right now, you're aware that you're aware. And that might be the strangest fact in the universe. Nothing else we know of can do this. Rocks can't, trees can't, even computers can't. But somehow, you can look at your own thoughts like they're objects in your hand. Let's dive through 100 levels of the magic we call consciousness. Level 1. The mirror test. Let's start with something simple. If you put a mirror in front of most animals, they don't recognize themselves. A dog sees another dog. A bird sees another bird. They might bark at it or try to fly through it, or just ignore it completely. But some animals do something different. Chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants, and a few others will look at the mirror and realize, that's me. They'll touch a mark on their face that they can only see in the reflection. They understand that the image is not another creature, but themselves, seen from outside. This is called the mirror test, and it's one of the simplest ways we try to measure something about consciousness. It's not perfect. There are animals that might be conscious but don't care about mirrors, but it points to something important. To recognize yourself, you need to have a sense of self in the first place. You need to be able to step back from your own experience and observe it, like you're watching yourself from a distance. Humans do this constantly. You don't just feel hungry, you notice that you're feeling hungry. You don't just think a thought, you can watch yourself thinking it. This ability to observe your own mind, to be aware of your own awareness, is called metacognition. And it's one of the most mysterious things about being human. It's so natural to us that we rarely stop to notice how strange it is. Level 2. The hard problem. There's a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be incredibly difficult. Why does it feel like something to be you? You could imagine a version of the universe where everything works exactly the same. Your brain processes information, you react to the world, you make decisions. But there's no inner experience, no feeling, no sense that anyone is home. Philosophers call this the hard problem of consciousness, and it's been argued about for decades. The easy problems, and they're not actually easy, are things like how the brain processes light or how memory works. Those are questions about mechanisms, about how the parts fit together. But the hard problem is different. It's asking why all of that processing creates the feeling of being alive, the sense of redness when you see red, the taste of chocolate, the ache of sadness. Why isn't it all just happening in the dark, so to speak, without anyone experiencing it? No one has solved this problem. Some scientists think consciousness is just what complex information processing feels like from the inside. Others think it's something we'll never fully explain with science. And some think the question itself might be confused, that we're asking the wrong thing. But what everyone agrees on is that consciousness is deeply strange. It's the thing you know most intimately, you're experiencing it right now, and yet it's the thing we understand least. Level 3. The split brain. In the 1960s, doctors tried a radical treatment for severe epilepsy. They cut the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerves that connects the left and right halves of the brain. The idea was to stop seizures from spreading from one side to the other, and it worked. But it also revealed something shocking about consciousness. After the surgery, patients seemed mostly normal. They could walk, talk, live their lives. But in careful experiments, researchers found something strange. The left half of the brain and the right half seemed to be conscious separately. If you showed a picture to only the left eye, which connects to the right brain, the patient couldn't say what they saw because language is in the left brain, but their left hand, controlled by the right brain, could point to the matching object. It was as if there were two consciousnesses inside one skull, each aware of different things, each responding in its own way. The left brain would sometimes make up explanations for actions the right brain had initiated, creating stories to explain behavior it didn't actually control. This raises an unsettling question. If you can split consciousness by cutting a bundle of nerves, what does that say about what consciousness is? Is it one thing or many? Are you one person or a collection of processes that usually cooperate but don't have to? Level 4. Attention as a spotlight. You've probably heard the phrase paying attention, and it's more literal than it sounds. Attention works like a spotlight in a dark theater. Right now, you're paying attention to these words. Everything else in your awareness, the feeling of your hands, the sounds around you, the pressure of sitting or standing, all of that fades into the background. It's still there. Your brain is still processing it, but it's not in the spotlight. Researchers have done experiments where they show people a video of people passing a basketball and ask them to count the passes. Halfway through, someone in a gorilla suit walks right through the middle of the scene, and a huge percentage of people don't see the gorilla. Not because their eyes didn't register it, but because their attention was elsewhere. The gorilla was outside the spotlight. This tells us something important. Consciousness is not the same as seeing or hearing. Your eyes take in a huge amount of information, but only a tiny fraction of it reaches conscious awareness. Your brain is constantly filtering, deciding what's important enough to show you. Consciousness is selective, and what gets selected depends on what you're paying attention to. Which means, in a very real sense, you're only conscious of a small sliver of what's actually happening around you and inside you. The rest is in the dark, processed, but not experienced. Level 5. Blindsight. There are people who are blind but can still see in a very strange way. They've suffered damage to the visual cortex, the part of the brain that processes sight, and they report being completely blind in part, or all of their visual field. If you ask them what's in front of them, they'll say they see nothing. But if you ask them to guess, to point at an object or navigate around obstacles, they can do it, far better than chance. They're responding to visual information they're not consciously aware of. This is called blindsight, and it's one of the clearest examples of the difference between processing information and being conscious of it. The person's eyes are working. The information is getting into the brain. Some parts of the brain are using that information to guide behavior. But the part of the brain that creates the conscious experience of seeing is damaged, so there's no experience, no image in the mind, just accurate behavior without awareness. This suggests that consciousness is not necessary for a lot of what the brain does. You can respond to the world, make decisions, even navigate complex environments without being consciously aware of what you're doing. Consciousness might be a small part of what the brain is up to, a kind of summary or report of a much larger process happening beneath the surface. And that raises the question, what is consciousness for? Why do we have it at all if so much can happen without it? Level 6. The narrating self. There's a voice in your head, not literally, though it can feel that way, but a kind of inner commentary that narrates your experience. You might be thinking about what you're hearing right now, or planning what you'll do next, or replaying a conversation from earlier. This inner voice feels like the center of who you are, the self that's experiencing everything. But here's the thing. That voice is not in control as much as it thinks it is. A lot of research suggests that the conscious narrating self is more like a storyteller than a director. Decisions often get made by unconscious processes, and then the conscious self explains them afterward, creating a story about why you did what you did. You reach for a snack, and then your inner voice says, "I was hungry." But the decision to reach might have been made before you were consciously aware of being hungry. This doesn't mean you're not in control of your life. It means the relationship between consciousness and action is more complicated than it feels. Consciousness might be less about making decisions and more about making sense of them, stitching together a coherent narrative of who you are and why you do what you do. And that narrative, the story you tell yourself about yourself, becomes a huge part of your identity. It shapes how you see the past and how you imagine the future. But it's a story, not a recording. And like all stories, it's edited, selective, and sometimes wrong. Level 7. The Anesthesia Mystery. Every day, people go under general anesthesia for surgery. The anesthesiologist gives you a drug, and within seconds, you're unconscious. Not asleep, unconscious. There's no dreaming, no sense of time passing. You close your eyes in the operating room and open them in the recovery room, and it feels like no time has passed at all. And here's the strange part. We don't really know how it works. Anesthetics are some of the most widely used drugs in the world, and we've been using them for over a century, but the mechanism by which they turn off consciousness is still not fully understood. We know they affect the brain, obviously, but they don't target one specific area. Different anesthetics work in different ways, affecting different receptors and pathways, yet they all do the same thing: they erase consciousness. This is a clue. It suggests that consciousness doesn't live in one place. It's not like there's a consciousness center in the brain that you can turn off. Instead, consciousness seems to emerge from the way different parts of the brain communicate with each other. Anesthetics might work by disrupting that communication, breaking the connections that allow different brain regions to integrate information. When the network fragments, consciousness disappears, and when the connections restore, it comes back. But what that network is exactly, and how it creates the feeling of being awake and aware, remains one of the biggest mysteries in neuroscience. Level 8. Sleepwalking without awareness. Some people get up in the middle of the night, walk around, sometimes even cook or have conversations, and have no memory of it in the morning. This is sleepwalking, and it's more common than you might think. What's strange about it is that the person is clearly doing complex things. They're navigating space, avoiding obstacles, using their hands. But they're not conscious, or at least not in the way we normally think of consciousness. Sleepwalking happens during deep sleep, when the parts of the brain responsible for movement are active, but the parts responsible for conscious awareness are not. The person is moving, but they're not experiencing it. There's no sense of making a decision or being present. It's behavior without consciousness. And when they wake up, it's as if it never happened. This shows us that consciousness and action can be separated. You don't need to be aware to do things. Your brain can run programs, execute routines, respond to the environment, all without the light of consciousness turned on. Which raises the question again, what is consciousness adding? If you can walk, navigate, and act without it, why do we have conscious experience at all? One possibility is that consciousness is for dealing with the new and unexpected, for situations that don't have a routine or script. When things are automatic, consciousness isn't needed. But when you have to think, to plan, to imagine possibilities, that's when consciousness steps in. Level 9. The timing problem. Here's something strange. It takes time for your brain to process what's happening, but you don't experience that delay. When you clap your hands, you hear the sound at the same moment you feel the impact. But the sound has to travel through the air, hit your eardrum, get converted to electrical signals, and travel to your brain. The touch has to travel through nerves in your hands up to your brain. These signals arrive at different times, but your conscious experience stitches them together so they feel simultaneous. Researchers have tested this. If you tap your finger on a surface, you experience the touch and the sound as happening at the same moment. But if they artificially delay one of the signals, you start to notice. Your brain is doing something in the background, adjusting the timing so that your conscious experience feels smooth and coherent. It's editing reality before showing it to you. This means that what you're conscious of is always slightly in the past. Your brain has already done the work of processing, integrating, and organizing the information before you become aware of it. Consciousness is not immediate. It's a construction, a carefully assembled representation of the world that your brain presents to you after the fact. And most of the time, it works so well that you never notice the delay. But it's there. You're always living in a very short past, in a version of reality that your brain has already interpreted for you. Level 10. The philosophical zombie. Imagine a version of you that acts exactly like you. It talks, laughs, solves problems, expresses emotions, everything. But inside, there's no one home, no experience, no feeling. It's a robot made of biology that behaves as if it's conscious but isn't. Philosophers call this a philosophical zombie, and it's a thought experiment designed to probe the hard problem of consciousness. The question is, could such a thing exist? If you think it could, then consciousness is something extra, something beyond just the physical processes of the brain. If you think it couldn't, that any system that behaves like it's conscious must be conscious, then consciousness is just what certain kinds of information processing look like from the inside. There's no ghost in the machine, just the machine. Most people find the zombie idea unsettling because it suggests that consciousness could be absent even when everything looks normal. You can't tell from the outside whether someone is really conscious or just acting like they are. You assume other people are conscious because they act like you do, but that's an inference, not a proof. Philosophers have argued about this for years and there's no consensus, but the thought experiment forces you to confront what you think consciousness actually is. Is it something physical, something that arises from the brain? Or is it something else, something that science might never fully capture? Level 11. Infant consciousness. When does consciousness begin? If you watch a newborn baby, they're clearly aware of something. They respond to light, sound, touch. They cry when they're uncomfortable. But are they conscious in the way you are? Do they have a sense of self? Do they experience the world as a continuous, unified thing? Researchers believe that consciousness develops gradually. A newborn's brain is not fully formed. The connections between different regions are still growing and strengthening. Their attention is scattered, reactive, not yet focused. Over the first few years of life, as the brain develops, consciousness becomes more organized, more stable. Babies start to recognize themselves in mirrors around 18 months. They start to use language to describe their inner states. They develop memory, the ability to anticipate the future, the sense that they are a self that persists over time. This suggests that consciousness is not all or nothing. It's not like a light switch that turns on at birth. It's more like a dimmer, gradually increasing in intensity and complexity as the brain matures. And if that's true, it raises difficult questions. If consciousness develops, at what point does it become morally significant? When does a developing brain cross the threshold into something that deserves moral consideration? These aren't just philosophical questions. They have real implications for medicine, for law, for how we think about the beginning of life. Level 12. Animal consciousness. Do animals have consciousness? Most people would say yes, at least for some animals. Your dog seems to have feelings. It acts happy when you come home, anxious when you leave. But how do we know? We can't ask the dog. We have to infer from behavior, and behavior can be misleading. Scientists now believe that many animals are conscious, but their consciousness might be very different from ours. A bat uses echolocation to navigate. What's it like to be a bat, to experience the world through sound bouncing off objects? A philosopher named Thomas Nagel wrote an essay about this, arguing that we can't really know. We can describe the bat's brain, its behavior, its echolocation system, but we can't step inside its subjective experience. There's something it's like to be a bat, but we'll never know what that something is. This is true for all animals. An octopus has a completely different kind of brain, with neurons distributed through its arms. Does each arm have its own consciousness? Is the octopus one self, or many? We don't know. What we do know is that consciousness probably isn't unique to humans. It might be widespread in the animal kingdom, taking many forms, most of which we can barely imagine. And if that's true, it changes how we think about our place in the world. We're not the only ones aware of being alive. We're part of a much larger community of conscious beings, each experiencing the world in their own way. Level 13. Dreams as consciousness without input. Every night you enter a state where you're conscious but disconnected from the world. You're dreaming. In a dream, you see things, hear things, feel emotions, and it all seems real in the moment, but none of it is coming from outside. Your eyes are closed, your ears are processing sound, but you're not responding to it. The entire experience is being generated by your brain, with no external input. Dreams show us that consciousness doesn't need the external world to exist. Your brain can create a fully immersive experience entirely on its own. Sometimes dreams are bizarre, impossible, but while you're in them, they make sense. You don't question why you're flying or why your childhood home has rooms you've never seen before. The critical part of your brain, the part that evaluates and questions, is mostly offline during dreaming. You're conscious, but your consciousness is untethered, free to create without being checked by reality. This tells us something important. Consciousness is not a passive reception of information, it's an active construction. Your brain is always building a model of the world, a simulation, and most of the time that simulation is constrained by sensory input. But in dreams, the constraints are lifted. The brain builds the simulation from memory, emotion, random neural firing, whatever's available. And the result is a kind of pure consciousness, experience without the world. It's strange to think that the vivid, real-feeling world you experience right now might not be so different from a dream. Both are constructions. One is just more tightly constrained by input from your senses. Level 14, Meditation and Observing the Mind. For thousands of years, people have practiced meditation, sitting quietly and paying attention to their own minds. And many of them report discovering something surprising. When you watch your thoughts carefully, you start to notice that they arise on their own. You don't consciously decide to think the next thought. It just appears. And then another one, and another. This is a direct experiential encounter with something scientists have also observed. Much of what happens in your mind is not under conscious control. Thoughts, emotions, impulses, they bubble up from unconscious processes. Consciousness is more like a stage where these things appear than a director controlling them. Meditators often describe a shift in perspective. Instead of identifying with the thoughts, they start to see thoughts as events that happen in consciousness, like clouds passing through the sky. This doesn't mean you're not in control of your actions. You can choose whether to follow a thought, whether to act on an impulse. But the thought or impulse itself arises without conscious intention. Meditation is a way of investigating consciousness from the inside, using attention itself as a tool. And what people often find is that consciousness is more spacious, more open, and less personal than it seems. The sense of a solid, continuous self starts to feel more like a process, a flow, something constantly changing rather than a fixed thing. This has been described by contemplatives for millennia, and now neuroscience is starting to catch up, mapping the brain changes that happen during meditation and trying to understand what they reveal about the nature of mind. Level 15, The Binding Problem. Your brain doesn't process information in one place. Vision is processed in the back of your brain, sound in the sides, language on the left, spatial awareness on the right, and so on. Different features of the same object are processed in different areas. The color of an apple is processed separately from its shape, which is processed separately from its location. So how do you experience it as one unified apple? This is called the binding problem. Somehow your brain takes all these separate streams of processing and binds them together into a single, coherent, conscious experience. You don't see a color floating over here and a shape over there. You see a red, round apple in front of you. And you do this effortlessly, instantly, for everything you perceive. Researchers have studied this extensively, and while we know that timing matters, that neurons processing related information fire in synchrony, we don't fully understand how the binding happens. The binding problem is part of the larger mystery of how consciousness feels unified. You have one continuous experience, even though your brain is made of billions of separate neurons doing their own thing. There's no central place where it all comes together, no Cartesian theater where some little observer watches the show. Instead, consciousness seems to emerge from the coordination of many different processes happening in parallel, communicating with each other in ways we're only beginning to understand. The unity of your experience is an illusion, or maybe a better word is an achievement, something your brain accomplishes every moment without you having to think about it. Level 16, Consciousness and Memory. Imagine you lived only in the present moment, no memory of the past, no anticipation of the future. Just now, over and over. That might sound peaceful, but it would also be strange. There are people who, due to brain damage, live close to this state. They can't form new memories. Every few minutes their experience resets, They meet someone, have a conversation, and a few minutes later, they've forgotten it completely. One famous case is a man named Clive Waring, who suffered severe brain damage that destroyed his ability to form new long-term memories. He lives in a perpetual present. He writes in his diary, "I am now conscious for the first time, over and over, each time believing it's true." He recognizes his wife, because that memory is older than the damage, but he doesn't remember what happened 5 minutes ago. This shows that consciousness is not just about the present moment, it's deeply tied to memory. Your sense of self, your identity, depends on being able to remember your past and project yourself into the future. Without memory, consciousness becomes fragmented, unmoored. Each moment is vivid, but there's no continuity, no story. This raises questions about what consciousness is for. Maybe it's not just about being aware right now. Maybe it's about creating a continuous narrative, linking past, present, and future into a coherent sense of being a self moving through time. Memory is the glue that holds consciousness together, and without it, the sense of self starts to dissolve. Level 17. The sense of self. Who are you? It seems like an easy question. You're you. You've been you your whole life. But what exactly is the self? If you think about it carefully, it's hard to pin down. Are you your body? But your body is constantly changing, replacing cells, aging. Are you your memories? But memories are unreliable and fade. Are you your thoughts? But thoughts come and go, and many of them feel automatic, not really yours. Neuroscience suggests that the self is not a thing. It's a process, a pattern of activity in the brain that creates the feeling of being someone. There are specific brain regions involved. Damage to certain areas can disrupt the sense of self in strange ways. Some people feel like their limbs don't belong to them. Others lose the sense that they're the ones initiating their actions. The self is constructed, moment by moment, by the brain. And it's a useful construction. Having a sense of self helps you navigate the social world. It allows you to distinguish your thoughts from other people's thoughts, your actions from their actions. It lets you plan, because you can imagine yourself in the future. But the self is also flexible. In deep meditation, the sense of self can dissolve temporarily. People report feeling like they're not separate from the world, that the boundary between self and other has blurred or disappeared. This suggests that the self is not fundamental. It's something the brain creates, and under certain conditions, it can be turned down or even turned off. And when that happens, consciousness continues, but it feels very different, more open, less personal. Level 18. Locked-in syndrome. Imagine being fully conscious but completely unable to move or speak. You can see, hear, and think, but you can't respond. This is called locked-in syndrome, and it happens when there's damage to the brainstem, the part of the brain that controls voluntary movement, but the higher brain regions responsible for consciousness remain intact. People with locked-in syndrome are awake and aware, but to an outside observer, they might look comatose or vegetative. For years, some people were assumed to be unconscious, when they were actually fully aware, trapped inside their own bodies. Technology has changed this. With eye-tracking devices or brain-computer interfaces, some locked-in patients can communicate. And when they do, they often report that they were conscious the whole time, thinking, experiencing emotions, aware of what was happening around them. This is one of the most profound demonstrations that consciousness and behavior can be completely separated. You can have full, rich conscious experience with almost no ability to interact with the world. It also raises ethical questions. How do we care for someone who can't communicate? How do we know they're suffering or content? Locked-in syndrome forces us to confront the limits of what we can observe about consciousness from the outside. Just because someone isn't responding doesn't mean they're not aware. Consciousness is an inner state, and sometimes the only sign of it is locked inside, invisible to the rest of us. Level 19. Consciousness in minimal states. Some people exist in states between consciousness and unconsciousness. After severe brain injury, a person might be in a vegetative state where they're awake but show no signs of awareness. or they might be in a minimally conscious state where they show occasional inconsistent signs of awareness, like following an object with their eyes or responding to a command. These states are heartbreaking and complicated. Doctors used to think that people in vegetative states were not conscious at all. But recent research has challenged that. Using brain scanning technology, researchers found that some patients who appeared vegetative showed brain activity when asked to imagine playing tennis or walking through their house. The activity was similar to what you'd see in a healthy person doing the same mental task. This suggests they might be conscious, but unable to move or communicate in ways we can detect. This has huge implications. It means that our judgments about who is conscious and who isn't are not always accurate. Consciousness might be present even when there's no outward sign. It also makes end-of-life decisions incredibly difficult. If someone shows no behavior but might still be aware, what's the right thing to do? There are no easy answers. What's clear is that consciousness is more resilient and more hidden than we thought. It can persist in conditions we don't fully understand, and our tools for detecting it are still limited. Level 20. Synesthesia. For most people, the senses are separate. You see colors, hear sounds, taste flavors, and each sense feels distinct. But some people experience something different. They might see colors when they hear music, or taste shapes, or feel that numbers have personalities. This is called synesthesia, and it's a blending of sensory experiences that most people don't have. Synesthesia is not a disorder, it's a variation in how the brain is wired. For reasons that aren't fully understood, the brain regions that process different senses are more connected in people with synesthesia. When one sense is activated, another is activated along with it, and the person experiences both simultaneously. Someone might say that the number 5 is red, and they don't mean it metaphorically. They actually see red when they think of 5. This tells us that conscious experience is shaped by the structure of the brain. The way your brain is wired determines what you perceive. For people with synesthesia, consciousness includes sensory combinations that most people never experience. It's a reminder that the way you experience the world is not the only way. Consciousness is subjective, and subjectivity varies. What's normal for you is not normal for everyone. The boundaries between senses, the way colors look, the way music sounds, all of this depends on the particular brain you happen to have. Consciousness is not one thing. It's a spectrum, and each of us is somewhere on it, experiencing reality in our own way. Level 21. The default mode. Network. When you're not focused on a task, when your mind is wandering, your brain doesn't turn off. It switches into a different mode. A network of brain regions, called the default mode network, becomes active. This network is involved in daydreaming, remembering the past, imagining the future, thinking about yourself and other people. Researchers discovered this network by accident. They noticed that when people were resting in brain scanners, not doing anything in particular, certain regions showed coordinated activity. And when people started focusing on a task, this network quieted down. It's like the brain has two modes, one for engaging with the external world and one for engaging with the internal world. The default mode network is where a lot of your conscious experience happens when you're not busy. It's the voice in your head, the mental time travel, the stories you tell yourself. Some researchers think this network is central to the sense of self, to the feeling of being someone with a past and a future. When the default mode network is disrupted through meditation or psychedelics, people often report a decrease in the sense of self, a feeling of being more present and less caught up in narrative. This shows that different kinds of consciousness are associated with different patterns of brain activity. The consciousness you have when you're focused on something is different from the consciousness you have when your mind is wandering, and both are different from the consciousness you have in deep meditation or under the influence of certain substances. Consciousness is not one state, it's many, and your brain shifts between them constantly depending on what you're doing and what you're paying attention to. Level 22. Pain without suffering. Pain is usually unpleasant. You touch a hot stove and it hurts and you want it to stop. But there's a strange condition where people feel pain but don't mind it. They can tell you that something hurts, but they're not bothered by it. This can happen after certain kinds of brain damage, specifically to areas involved in emotional processing. This shows that pain has two components. There's the sensory component, the signal that tissue is damaged. And there's the affective component, the unpleasantness, the suffering. Normally, these are linked, but they can be separated. You can have the sensation without the suffering. And if you can have pain without suffering, that means suffering is something the brain adds, an interpretation of the signal rather than the signal itself. This has implications for how we think about consciousness. A lot of what you experience is not raw sensation. It's sensation plus interpretation plus emotion plus context. Your brain is constantly adding layers of meaning to incoming information. Pain becomes suffering. A sound becomes a song. A face becomes familiar. Consciousness is not a passive receiver. It's an active interpreter, constructing experience out of signals, and the construction can vary depending on what the brain is doing. This is also why meditation practices that focus on observing pain without reacting to it can change the experience. The pain doesn't go away, but the suffering decreases. You're not eliminating the signal. You're changing the relationship your consciousness has with it, and that change, subtle as it sounds, can make a profound difference in how you experience being alive. Level 23. The continuity illusion. Right now, you feel like you've been continuously conscious for hours, maybe all day. But have you? Every time you blink, there's a brief gap in visual input, but you don't experience it. Your brain edits out the blinks so your visual experience feels smooth. When you move your eyes, the world blurs, but you don't notice. Your brain suppresses the blur. Sleep is even more dramatic. You go to bed, lose consciousness entirely, and wake up hours later with no sense of the time that passed. If you didn't have a clock, you'd have no idea if you'd been asleep for minutes or hours. Yet when you wake up, you feel like you're the same person who went to sleep, like there's been a continuous you the whole time. This continuity is an illusion. Consciousness is actually full of gaps, interruptions, edits. But your brain stitches the pieces together into a seamless narrative. It creates the sense that you've been here the whole time, that there's been no break. And this sense of continuity is central to your identity. You think of yourself as a continuous self, moving through time. But really, you're a series of conscious moments, separated by gaps you don't notice, linked together by memory and narrative into the feeling of being one person. This matters because it shows that much of what feels certain and obvious about consciousness is actually constructed. The smoothness, the continuity, the sense of being a unified self, these are not given. They're achievements, things your brain actively creates and maintains. And when the brain is damaged or altered, these constructions can break down, revealing just how fragile and flexible consciousness actually is. Level 24. Conscious versus unconscious processing. You might think that you're consciously aware of everything your brain is doing, but that's not even close to true. The vast majority of brain activity is unconscious. Your brain is constantly monitoring your body, regulating breathing, heartbeat, digestion, adjusting balance, filtering sensory input, and you're not aware of any of it. Even things that feel conscious often aren't. When you recognize a face, the recognition happens instantly, before you're consciously aware of it. When you read, your eyes jump ahead, processing words you haven't consciously noticed yet. When you make decisions, unconscious processes often arrive at the answer before your conscious mind is aware that there's a question. Some researchers think consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. The real work is happening beneath the surface, and consciousness is more like a summary, a simplified report of what the unconscious has already figured out. This is efficient. Conscious processing is slow and requires a lot of energy. Unconscious processing is fast and automatic. For most tasks, you don't need consciousness, you just need behavior. Consciousness steps in when things are novel, ambiguous, or require deliberation. This means that you're not as in control as you feel. A lot of what you do is driven by processes you're not aware of. but it also means that consciousness is special. It's what you have for the hard problems, the situations that can't be handled automatically. Consciousness is the brain's tool for dealing with uncertainty, for imagining possibilities, for integrating information in new ways. And that, perhaps, is what it's for. Level 25. The experience of time. Time feels like it flows at a constant rate, but your experience of time is actually very flexible. When you're bored, time drags. When you're engaged, it flies. When you're in danger, time seems to slow down. People in car accidents often report that everything happened in slow motion, that they had time to think and react in a way that wouldn't normally be possible. This is not just a feeling. Your brain really is processing more information when you're in a high arousal state, like fear or excitement. You're laying down richer memories. And later, when you remember the event, the richness of the memory makes it feel like it lasted longer. So the slowing of time is partly a retrospective illusion, but it's based on something real. Your brain is paying more attention, processing more, and that changes your experience of duration. This shows that consciousness of time is not just a passive reading of a clock. It's constructed by the brain, based on attention, arousal, and memory. You don't experience time directly. You experience the brain's model of time, and that model changes depending on what you're doing and how you're feeling. This is why time seems to speed up as you age. Fewer new experiences mean fewer rich memories, and without those memories, the years seem to compress. Understanding this can change how you experience life. If you want time to feel slower, richer, you need novelty and attention. You need to do new things, pay attention to details, create memories. Otherwise, time will slip by, and you'll look back wondering where it went. Consciousness shapes time, and you have more control over that shaping than you might think. Level 26. Consciousness and language. There's a deep connection between consciousness and language. Much of your inner experience is verbal. You think in words. You narrate your experience to yourself. You use language to organize your thoughts, to plan, to remember. But is language necessary for consciousness? Babies are conscious before they have language. Animals are conscious without language, at least not language like ours. So consciousness can exist without words. But language seems to change consciousness. It gives you the ability to think abstractly, to categorize, to reason about things that aren't present. You can think about the past and future in ways that would be difficult without language. You can reflect on your own thoughts, which is harder to do without words to label them. Some philosophers think that language creates a certain kind of self-awareness. When you name your emotions, you gain a kind of distance from them. You're not just angry, you're experiencing anger. The language creates a gap between the feeling and the self, and in that gap, reflection becomes possible. Without language, experience might be more immediate, more unified, but also less reflective. This suggests that human consciousness, the kind of consciousness that includes a rich inner life, storytelling, self-reflection, is partly a product of language. We're not just conscious. We're conscious in a linguistic way, and that shapes everything about how we experience the world. It's one of the things that makes human consciousness unique. We don't just have experiences, we narrate them, interpret them, share them. And in the sharing, we build culture, history, knowledge. Consciousness and language co-evolve, each shaping the other in ways that are still being explored. Level 27. Disorders of consciousness. Consciousness can break in strange ways. There's a condition called anosognosia, where people are unaware of their own deficits. Someone who's paralyzed on one side might insist they can move perfectly fine, even when shown evidence to the contrary. They're not lying. They genuinely believe they're not impaired. The part of the brain that monitors and updates self-awareness is damaged, so they can't see the problem. Another strange condition is Cotard's delusion, where people believe they're dead. They might say they don't exist, or that they're a walking corpse. Again, this is not metaphorical. They genuinely experience themselves as not alive. And then there's Capgras delusion, where people believe that someone close to them has been replaced by an identical imposter. The person looks the same, sounds the same, but something feels wrong, and the brain interprets that feeling as evidence of substitution. These disorders show how fragile and constructed consciousness is. What feels like direct, unmediated awareness of yourself in the world is actually the product of many different brain processes working together. When one of those processes breaks, the entire experience changes. You can be conscious but unaware of your own body, conscious but convinced you're dead, conscious but unable to recognize the people you love. This is both unsettling and illuminating. It shows that consciousness is not a single thing. It's made of parts, and the parts can fail independently. And when they do, they reveal just how much work the brain is doing behind the scenes to create the seamless, coherent experience you take for granted every day. Level 28. The feeling of knowing. Have you ever had the experience of a word on the tip of your tongue? You know it. You can feel that the knowledge is there, just out of reach, but you can't access it. This is called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, and it shows something interesting about consciousness. You can be conscious of knowing something without being conscious of the thing itself. There's a feeling of knowing, a metacognitive signal that tells you whether you have the information or not. And this feeling can be wrong. Sometimes you feel confident about something and you're mistaken. Sometimes you feel uncertain and you're right. The feeling of knowing is separate from actual knowledge, and it's generated by a different process. This matters because much of what you think you know is based on this feeling. You feel certain, so you stop questioning. But the certainty is just a signal, and signals can be faulty. False memories feel just as real as true ones. Confabulations, stories your brain makes up to fill in gaps, feel genuine. The subjective feeling of correctness is not reliable evidence. This is one of the reasons why metacognition, thinking about your own thinking, is so important. You need to be able to step back and ask, how do I know this? Is this feeling of certainty justified, or is it just a feeling? Consciousness gives you access to your own thoughts, but it doesn't automatically give you insight into whether those thoughts are accurate. That requires an additional step, a willingness to question even the things that feel most certain. Level 29. Consciousness and emotions. Emotions are central to consciousness, but they're often misunderstood. An emotion is not just a feeling. It's a whole body response. When you're afraid, your heart races, your muscles tense, your attention narrows. The feeling of fear is your conscious awareness of all these changes. But the changes come first, your body reacts, and then you become conscious of the reaction. This is called the James Lange theory of emotion, proposed over a century ago. You don't run because you're afraid. You're afraid because you run. The conscious feeling is the brain's interpretation of what the body is doing. This has been refined over the years, but the basic insight remains. Emotions are embodied. They're not just mental states. They involve the whole organism. This means that consciousness of emotion is always consciousness of the body. You feel emotions in your chest, your stomach, your throat, and if you pay close attention, you can notice the physical sensations before you label them as fear or sadness or joy. This is one of the practices in mindfulness, learning to observe emotions as physical sensations rather than as monolithic states. And when you do this, something interesting happens. The emotions become less overwhelming. You're not consumed by fear. You're noticing the sensation of a racing heart, tight shoulders, rapid breath. The shift in perspective creates distance, and in that distance, you have more choice about how to respond. Consciousness, when directed skillfully, can change your relationship to emotion, not eliminating the feeling, but making space around it so it doesn't control you. Level 30. The illusion of free will. Here's one of the most controversial ideas in the study of consciousness. Some researchers believe that free will is an illusion. The feeling that you consciously choose your actions is real, but the choice might already be made by unconscious processes before you're aware of it. The most famous experiment is by a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet. He asked people to press a button whenever they felt like it, and to note the exact moment they decided to press it. Meanwhile, he recorded their brain activity. He found that there was a buildup of activity in the brain, called the readiness potential, that started about half a second before people reported making the decision. The brain was preparing to act before consciousness knew about it. This doesn't mean you're not responsible for your actions. It means the relationship between consciousness and action is more complicated. Consciousness might not be initiating the action. It might be becoming aware of an action that's already in motion. You still have the ability to veto, to stop an action once it's begun. But the initiation might not be conscious. This is deeply unsettling for many people because it challenges the feeling of being in control. But it might also be liberating. If your actions arise from a complex interaction of unconscious processes, genetics, environment, and past experience, then maybe you can be less harsh with yourself when things go wrong. You're not a perfectly rational agent making free choices. You're a biological system doing the best it can with the processes it has. And understanding that, really understanding it, might change how you relate to yourself and others. Level 31. The Neural Correlates of Consciousness. Scientists have been searching for the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain activity that corresponds to conscious experience. If you could identify exactly what's happening in the brain when you're conscious, you'd be much closer to understanding what consciousness is. There's been some progress. Certain patterns of activity seem to be associated with consciousness. For example, when you're conscious, there's widespread communication between different brain regions. Information flows back and forth, integrating sensory input, memory, emotion, and planning. When you're unconscious, under anesthesia or in deep sleep, this communication decreases. The brain becomes more modular, with different regions working in isolation. But finding the neural correlates is not the same as explaining consciousness. You can describe the activity, but that doesn't tell you why that activity feels like something. It's the hard problem again. You can map every neuron, every connection, every spike of electrical activity, and you still haven't explained the subjective experience. The redness of red. The painfulness of pain. Some scientists think this gap will eventually close, that once we understand the brain well enough, consciousness will no longer be mysterious. Others think there's something about subjective experience that can't be captured by objective description, no matter how detailed. This is not a settled question. It's an active area of research and debate, and the answer, when and if we find it, will reshape our understanding of what it means to be conscious. Level 32. Integrated Information Theory. One of the leading theories of consciousness is called Integrated Information Theory, or IIT. It was developed by a neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi. The basic idea is that consciousness corresponds to integrated information. A system is conscious to the extent that it integrates information in a way that's more than the sum of its parts. What does that mean? Imagine a simple camera. It takes in visual information, but each pixel is processed independently. There's no integration, no relationship between the different parts of the image. Now imagine your brain. When you see a face, your brain integrates the shape, the color, the expression, the context, the memory of who the person is, all into one unified experience. The information is not just processed, it's integrated in a way that creates something new. IIT makes specific predictions. It says that consciousness is not all or nothing, it's a matter of degree. Some systems have more integrated information than others, and therefore more consciousness. It also says that consciousness doesn't depend on being biological. Any system that integrates information in the right way could be conscious, even a computer, in principle. This is a controversial theory. Some people think it's the best explanation we have. Others think it's flawed, that it predicts consciousness in systems that clearly aren't conscious. But it's an example of how scientists are trying to move beyond just describing consciousness to actually explaining it in terms of measurable properties of physical systems. Whether IIT is right or not, it represents a shift toward treating consciousness as something that can be studied scientifically, not just philosophically. Level 33. Global Workspace Theory. Another major theory is called Global Workspace Theory. This theory, developed by Bernard Bars, suggests that consciousness is like a theater. At any moment, many different processes are happening in the brain, but only a small amount of information makes it to the stage, the global workspace, where it becomes conscious. The global workspace is a kind of broadcasting system. Information that enters the workspace is broadcast widely to many different brain regions, which can then use that information to guide behavior. So consciousness is not about one specific brain region or process, it's about information becoming globally available. This explains why consciousness feels unified. Even though many things are happening in parallel, only one thing, or a small set of things, is in the spotlight at any given time. This is also why attention matters. Attention is the mechanism that selects what enters the global workspace. If you're not paying attention to something, it might be processed unconsciously, but it won't become part of your conscious experience. Global workspace theory has been influential because it connects nicely with what we know about the brain. It explains why certain kinds of brain activity, widespread, integrated activity, are associated with consciousness. And it provides a framework for thinking about disorders of consciousness. If the global workspace is damaged or disrupted, consciousness fades or disappears. Like all theories, it has its critics. Some argue that it describes what happens during consciousness, but doesn't explain why it feels like something. But it's a valuable piece of the puzzle, and it's helped guide research into the mechanisms that underlie conscious awareness. Level 34. Consciousness as prediction. There's a growing idea in neuroscience that the brain is not primarily reactive, responding to the world, but predictive, constantly generating models of what's about to happen. Consciousness, in this view, is the brain's best guess about the current state of the world based on incoming sensory data and prior expectations. You're not directly perceiving reality. You're perceiving a simulation, a model that your brain constructs and constantly updates. Most of the time, the model is pretty accurate so you don't notice. But when there's a mismatch, when the prediction is wrong, that's when you become consciously aware of something surprising or unexpected. This is called predictive processing or predictive coding, and it's changed how scientists think about perception and consciousness. It explains a lot of phenomena. Why you don't notice the sensation of your clothes on your skin unless you think about it. It's predicted and filtered out. Why magic tricks work. They violate your predictions, creating surprise. Why expectations shape perception. Because perception is partly prediction. If this theory is right, then consciousness is less about passively receiving information and more about actively constructing a model of reality. You're hallucinating all the time, and sensory input just keeps the hallucination in check. This might sound strange, but it fits the evidence, and it suggests that consciousness is fundamentally about making sense of the world, about building a coherent, usable model that allows you to navigate and act. Level 35. Altered states. Consciousness is not one thing. It comes in different states, and you can move between them. You've already experienced several: waking, sleeping, dreaming. But there are others. Meditation can shift consciousness into a state of calm focus or open awareness. Psychedelics can create states where the boundaries between self and world dissolve, where perceptions are intensely vivid and meaning feels overwhelming. These altered states are windows into the flexibility of consciousness. They show that the normal waking state is just one configuration, one way the brain can organize experience. And by studying altered states, researchers can learn about the mechanisms that create normal consciousness. For example, psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD increase communication between brain regions that don't normally talk to each other. This creates unusual associations, visual distortions, a sense of profound insight. People often describe these experiences as among the most meaningful of their lives, and there's growing evidence that, under the right conditions, they can have lasting positive effects on mental health. Altered states also raise philosophical questions. If consciousness can be so radically different depending on brain chemistry, which state is the real one? Is waking consciousness more true than a meditative or psychedelic state? Or are they all equally valid, just different modes of experience? There's no obvious answer, but the question forces you to recognize that your normal experience is not the only way to be conscious. It's just the most familiar. Level 36. The role of attention. Attention is one of the most important aspects of consciousness. You can only be consciously aware of what you're paying attention to. Everything else fades into the background, processed unconsciously or not at all. Attention is selective. Right now, you're attending to these words. But there are sounds around you, sensations in your body, thoughts on the edge of awareness, and you're not consciously experiencing most of it. If you shift your attention, the contents of consciousness change. You can bring your attention to your breath, and suddenly you're aware of the sensation of air moving in and out. You can bring your attention to a sound, and it becomes clear and distinct. This shows that consciousness is not just about what's present in the brain, it's about what the brain is focusing on. Attention is like a filter or a spotlight, and what's inside the spotlight is what you experience. This also means that you have some control over consciousness. You can train attention through practices like meditation, and in doing so, you change what you're conscious of. Attention is also limited. You can only focus on one thing or a few things at a time. This is why multitasking is so difficult. You're not really doing two things at once. You're rapidly switching attention between them, and each switch has a cost. Understanding the limits of attention helps you understand the limits of consciousness. You can't be aware of everything. You have to choose, and the quality of your choices shapes the quality of your experience. Level 37. The continuity of self across time. Earlier, we talked about the continuity illusion, the sense that you've been conscious without interruption. But there's a deeper question. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? In what sense? Your body has changed, your cells have been replaced, your beliefs, your memories, your personality, they've all shifted. If everything about you is different, in what sense are you the same person? This is a version of the ship of Theseus problem, applied to personal identity. One answer is psychological continuity. You're the same person because you remember being that person 10 years ago. There's a chain of memory linking the past you to the present you. But memory is fallible. You forget things. You misremember. And if memory is what makes you the same person, then forgetting means you're no longer the same. Another answer is narrative continuity. You're the same person because you tell a story about yourself that connects past, present, and future. You have a sense of being someone with a history and a direction. The story creates the self, and as long as the story continues, the self continues. But both of these are constructions. The self is not a solid, unchanging thing. It's a process, a flow, constantly recreating itself from moment to moment, and recognizing this can be both disorienting and freeing. You're not stuck being who you were. You can change, because you're always changing. The self is not fixed, it's flexible, and that flexibility is part of what it means to be conscious. Level 38. Consciousness and morality. Is consciousness what makes something morally considerable? Most people believe you shouldn't cause suffering, and suffering requires consciousness. A rock can't suffer because it's not conscious. A person can suffer because they are conscious. So consciousness seems central to morality. But this raises difficult questions. If consciousness matters morally, then where's the line? Are all conscious beings equally morally important? Do animals deserve the same consideration as humans? What about insects? What about possible future AI systems that might be conscious? Different ethical frameworks answer these questions differently. Some say only humans matter because only humans have rationality or language or souls. Others say all sentient beings matter, and sentience is just the capacity for conscious experience, especially pleasure and pain. Still others argue for degrees of moral consideration based on the complexity or richness of consciousness. There's no consensus, but what's clear is that consciousness is deeply tied to how we think about ethics. If you care about well-being, you're caring about the quality of conscious experience. If you care about rights, you're probably assuming that the rights holders are conscious. And as our understanding of consciousness grows, it will inevitably reshape our moral landscape. We'll have to decide which beings are conscious, to what degree, and what we owe them. These are not abstract questions. They have real implications for how we treat animals, each other, and any new forms of intelligence we create. Level 39. The problem of other minds. You know you're conscious because you experience it directly. But how do you know anyone else is conscious? You can see their behavior, hear them talk, but you can't directly access their experience. This is called the problem of other minds. You infer that others are conscious because they act like you do. They react to pain, express emotions, solve problems. It would be very strange if they did all this without being conscious, so you assume they are. But it's an assumption, not a proof. This problem becomes more acute with animals and AI. A dog acts like it feels pain, but does it really? Or is it just a complex stimulus response machine? A computer might one day pass the Turing test, convincingly simulating human conversation. Would that mean it's conscious? Or would it be an imitation, behavior without experience? There's no way to definitively solve the problem of other minds. You can never step inside someone else's consciousness to check. All you have is behavior and your own experience as a reference. This doesn't lead to solipsism, the belief that only you are conscious. It's far more reasonable to believe that others are conscious. But it does mean that consciousness is fundamentally private. You can share the contents of consciousness through language and art, but the experience itself is always yours alone. Level 40. Consciousness in artificial intelligence. Could a machine be conscious? This is one of the most debated questions in philosophy and AI research. Right now, no one thinks current AI systems are conscious. They process information, generate outputs, but there's no reason to believe there's something it's like to be a neural network. But what about the future? If consciousness is just information processing organized in the right way, then in principle, a sufficiently advanced AI could be conscious. It wouldn't need to be biological. It would just need to integrate information, have goals, perhaps have something like attention and self-monitoring. Others argue that consciousness requires more than just computation. Maybe it requires a biological brain or a body or interaction with the world in a particular way. Maybe there's something about organic evolved systems that's essential. We don't know. What's clear is that this question will become urgent. As AI systems become more capable, more autonomous, more human-like in their behavior, people will start asking whether they're conscious. And if they are, that has huge ethical implications. Would it be wrong to turn off a conscious AI? To own one? To cause it to suffer? We don't have answers yet. But the questions are coming, and we need to start thinking about them seriously. Consciousness might not be unique to biology, and if it's not, the moral landscape will expand in ways we're only beginning to imagine. Level 41. The spectrum of consciousness. Consciousness is not binary, not on or off. It's a spectrum. Some creatures have rich, complex conscious experiences. Others have simple, minimal awareness. Some states of consciousness are clear and vivid. Others are dim and confused. Think about the difference between being fully awake and alert versus being drowsy, or the difference between a human and a worm. Consciousness comes in degrees, varying in intensity, complexity, and content. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Consciousness probably didn't appear all at once. It evolved gradually, starting with simple awareness in early organisms and becoming more complex over time. This spectrum perspective changes how we think about consciousness. Instead of asking, "Is this thing conscious?" we should ask, "How conscious is it?" And conscious in what way? A bee might have a very different kind of consciousness than a human, simpler in some ways, but perhaps more attuned to certain kinds of information. Recognizing the spectrum also makes ethical questions more nuanced. If consciousness is not all or nothing, then moral consideration might not be either. Maybe more complex consciousness deserves more consideration, or maybe even simple consciousness deserves protection. These are open questions, but the spectrum view at least gives us a more realistic framework for thinking about them. Level 42. Consciousness and evolution. Why did consciousness evolve? What purpose does it serve? If so much can be done unconsciously, if behavior can be generated without awareness, why have consciousness at all? One answer is that consciousness is for dealing with novelty and complexity. When situations are familiar and routine, unconscious, automatic processes can handle them. But when something unexpected happens, when you need to consider multiple options, plan ahead, imagine possibilities, consciousness steps in. It's flexible in a way that automatic processes are not. Another answer is that consciousness is for social coordination. Humans are deeply social, and much of our survival depends on cooperation. Being able to think about what others are thinking, to communicate complex ideas, to share intentions and plans, all of this is made easier by consciousness. Maybe consciousness evolved partly to facilitate culture and cooperation. There's also the possibility that consciousness is a byproduct, not an adaptation. Maybe it emerges inevitably from complex information processing and doesn't have a specific function. It's just what it feels like to be a brain of a certain complexity. We don't know for sure. Evolution doesn't leave behind clear records of why things developed, but thinking about consciousness in evolutionary terms helps ground it. Consciousness is not magic. It's a biological phenomenon, shaped by the same forces that shaped everything else about us. And understanding those forces might help us understand what consciousness is and why we have it. Level 43. Unconscious influences on behavior. You like to think you're in control, that your conscious mind decides what you do, but research shows that unconscious factors influence behavior far more than most people realize. Your mood affects your judgments in ways you don't notice. The weather influences how you vote. Hunger makes you more impatient. Smells, sounds, and visual cues can prime certain behaviors without you being aware of it. In one famous study, people who held a warm cup of coffee rated others as warmer and more friendly than people who held a cold cup. The physical sensation of warmth unconsciously influenced their social judgments. In another study, people were more likely to help someone if they'd just smelled fresh-baked cookies. The pleasant smell primed prosocial behavior. This doesn't mean you're a puppet, but it does mean that consciousness is not the sole driver of action. You're influenced by factors you don't see, and your conscious mind often rationalizes decisions that were made for unconscious reasons. This is humbling. It suggests that self-knowledge is harder than it seems. You don't have transparent access to why you do what you do. You have to infer, to guess, just like you infer the mental states of others. The upside is that if you know unconscious influences exist, you can sometimes compensate. You can be more careful about judgments made when you're tired or hungry. You can question snap decisions. You can create environments that nudge you toward better behavior. You're not fully in control, but you're not helpless either. Awareness of your limits is a form of power. Level 44. Consciousness and metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about thinking, being aware of your own mental processes. It's a higher order form of consciousness. You're not just thinking, you're aware that you're thinking, and you can evaluate and adjust your thinking. This ability is crucial for learning and problem solving. If you're working on a problem and you notice you're stuck, that noticing is metacognition. You can step back, reassess, try a different approach. Without metacognition, you just keep doing the same thing, unaware that it's not working. Metacognition also allows you to assess your own knowledge. You know what you know and what you don't know. You can judge how confident you should be in a belief. This is harder than it sounds. People are often overconfident, especially when they know just a little about something. True metacognition requires humility, the ability to recognize the limits of your knowledge. Children develop metacognition gradually. Young children often think they know more than they do. As they mature, they get better at monitoring their own understanding. And this development is crucial for education. Teaching someone to think isn't just teaching them facts. It's teaching them to reflect on their own thinking, to notice when they're confused, to ask questions, to revise beliefs. Consciousness, at its best, is metacognitive. It's not just experience. It's the capacity to examine and improve the quality of that experience. Level 45. The role of sleep. Consciousness is not constant. Every night you lose it, and every morning it returns. Sleep is essential, and part of what it does is related to consciousness and memory. During sleep, especially during REM sleep, the brain processes experiences from the day, consolidating memories, integrating information. Dreams are a strange form of consciousness during sleep. You're not receiving external input, but you're experiencing vivid, often bizarre scenarios. Some researchers think dreams are the brain's way of sorting through information, testing connections, organizing memories. Others think they're largely random, byproducts of neural activity without much purpose. What's clear is that sleep is not just the absence of waking consciousness, it's a different kind of consciousness, or a series of different kinds, depending on the sleep stage. And without sleep, waking consciousness deteriorates. You become foggy, irritable, impaired. Chronic sleep deprivation damages cognitive function in lasting ways. This tells us that consciousness depends on rest. You can't be awake and aware all the time. The brain needs downtime to maintain itself, to process, to reset. Consciousness is not just about being on, it's about the rhythm of being on and off, the cycle of waking and sleeping, and respecting that cycle is essential for healthy, clear, conscious experience. Level 46, the Neuroscience of Self-Awareness. Self-awareness, the ability to recognize yourself as a distinct entity, has been linked to specific brain regions. One important area is the medial prefrontal cortex, involved in thinking about yourself, your traits, your past and future. Damage to this area can impair self-awareness. Another important region is the insula, which processes internal bodily sensations. The insula helps create the sense of being an embodied self, a subject experiencing the world from a particular location. People with heightened insula activity tend to be more in tune with their bodily states, more aware of their own emotions. There's also the temporoparietal junction, involved in distinguishing self from other. This region helps you understand that your perspective is not the only one, that others have their own thoughts and feelings. Damage here can lead to difficulties with theory of mind, the ability to infer what others are thinking. Self-awareness is not one thing. It's a collection of processes distributed across the brain, working together to create the sense of being a self. And like other aspects of consciousness, it can be disrupted. People can lose self-awareness in various ways, feeling disconnected from their bodies, unable to recognize their own face, confused about their identity. These disruptions reveal that the self is not a given. It's constructed, actively maintained by the brain, and it can come apart when the brain is damaged or altered. Level 47. Flow states. Sometimes consciousness feels effortless. You're completely absorbed in what you're doing. Time seems to disappear, and you perform at your best. Psychologists call this a flow state, and it's one of the most rewarding forms of conscious experience. Flow happens when you're engaged in a task that's challenging but not overwhelming, when your skills match the difficulty. Athletes, musicians, artists, and even people doing everyday tasks like cooking or gardening can experience flow. The key is focus. You're not thinking about yourself. You're not distracted. You're fully present, and action flows naturally. In flow, the sense of self diminishes. You're not self-conscious. You're not monitoring your performance. You're just doing. Some researchers think this is because the brain regions associated with self-referential thinking, like the default mode network, quiet down during flow. Consciousness becomes less about the self and more about the activity. Flow states are important because they show that consciousness is not always effortful or divided. It can be unified, smooth, deeply satisfying. And you can cultivate flow by structuring tasks well, by practicing skills, by creating conditions that support deep focus. Flow is a reminder that consciousness at its best is not a burden. It's a resource, a capacity for engagement and joy. Level 48. The Limits of Introspection. You have some access to your own mind. You can reflect on your thoughts, notice your feelings, examine your beliefs. But introspection has limits. There are many mental processes you can't directly observe. You don't have access to how your brain recognizes faces or generates language or solves problems. You experience the results. The face is familiar, the sentence appears in your mind, the solution clicks, but the process itself is hidden. Even your motivations are often opaque. You might think you're acting for one reason when the real reason is something else entirely, something unconscious. Introspection can also be misleading. When you try to explain why you did something, you often confabulate, making up a reason that sounds plausible but isn't accurate. Your brain is good at generating explanations, but those explanations are not always based on actual self-knowledge. They're stories, and stories can be wrong. This means that consciousness gives you a window into your mind, but it's a limited, sometimes distorted window. You can't fully know yourself through introspection alone. You need external feedback, observations of your behavior, input from others. Self-knowledge is a project, not a given, and it requires humility about what you can and can't see from the inside. Level 49, the unity of consciousness. When you look at a scene, you don't experience the colors in one place, the shapes in another, and the motion somewhere else. You experience one unified scene. This is the unity of consciousness, the sense that all the parts of your experience come together into a single coherent whole. But as we've discussed, the brain processes different features separately. So how does unity arise? This is part of the binding problem. Some researchers think that synchronized neural activity is the key. When neurons fire in sync, the information they represent is bound together into a unified experience. Others think unity is more of an illusion. Maybe your experience is actually more fragmented than it seems, but you don't notice the seams because your attention jumps quickly from one thing to another and memory fills in the gaps. The unity is constructed retrospectively, not experienced in real time. Either way, the unity of consciousness is an achievement, not a given, and it can break down. In some altered states, people report that their experience feels fragmented, that they're aware of many things at once without them coming together. The normal unity dissolves and consciousness becomes more scattered, more chaotic. This shows that unity is something the brain actively creates, and it depends on the right conditions, the right kind of neural coordination. Level 50, the Phenomenology of Consciousness. Phenomenology is the study of experience from the first-person perspective. It's about describing what it's like, not explaining how it works. And phenomenologists have made careful observations about the structure of consciousness. For example, consciousness always has intentionality. It's always about something. You're not just conscious. You're conscious of a sound, a thought, a feeling. Consciousness is directed, pointed toward objects, whether those objects are external or internal. Consciousness also has a temporal structure. You don't just experience a single moment, you experience the present with a sense of the immediate past and the immediate future. When you hear a melody, you don't just hear one note, you hear the note in the context of the notes before and the expectation of what's coming. Consciousness spans a short duration, creating a sense of flow, and consciousness has a perspectival quality. You experience the world from a particular point of view, from here, from now, from this body. You can't experience the world from nowhere. There's always a perspective, and that perspective shapes what you can and can't see. These observations, careful and detailed, are valuable. They don't explain consciousness, but they describe it accurately, and accurate description is the first step toward understanding. Phenomenology reminds us that consciousness is not just a scientific problem. It's also a lived reality, and understanding it requires paying attention to what it's actually like, not just what the brain is doing. Level 51, Consciousness and Creativity. Creativity often feels like it comes out of nowhere. You're stuck on a problem, and then suddenly the solution appears. You're searching for a word, and then it pops into your mind. This is the role of the unconscious in creativity. Much of creative work happens below the surface, and consciousness is where the results emerge. But consciousness also plays a role. You need conscious attention to define the problem, to gather information, to evaluate ideas. And you need conscious effort to refine and execute creative work. The process is a back and forth between conscious and unconscious, between focused work and letting go. Some of the most creative people describe practices that support this rhythm. They work intensely, then take breaks, go for walks, sleep on it. The break allows the unconscious to work, making connections that the conscious mind couldn't see. And when they return to the work, new ideas have emerged. This suggests that consciousness is not the seat of creativity, but it's a necessary part of the process. Creativity requires both the freedom of unconscious association and the discipline of conscious refinement. And understanding this can help you be more creative. Don't just push harder when you're stuck. Give your unconscious time to work. Trust that the process is happening even when you're not aware of it. Level 52. The social nature of consciousness. You often think of consciousness as private, individual, but much of your conscious experience is shaped by others. Language, concepts, beliefs, values, you inherit these from your culture. Even the way you think about yourself, your identity, your self-narrative, is constructed in dialogue with others. Children develop consciousness in social contexts. They learn to pay attention by following the gaze and gestures of caregivers. They learn to recognize emotions by observing faces. They learn language through interaction. Consciousness is not just something that happens inside your head. It develops in relationship. And as adults, your consciousness continues to be social. You think about what others think. You imagine conversations. You model other people's perspectives. Much of your mental life is populated by others, even when you're alone. In a sense, you're never fully alone in consciousness. You carry others with you, internalized voices and perspectives that shape your thoughts. This social dimension is one of the things that makes human consciousness unique. We're not just individually aware. We're aware together, creating shared meanings, shared worlds. Culture is the collective product of many consciousnesses interacting over time, and each individual consciousness is shaped by that culture in return. You're not separate from the social world. You're part of it, and it's part of you. Level 53. The experience of the present moment. Right now, you're experiencing the present moment. But what is the present? How long does it last? If you think about it, the present seems to be a boundary between past and future, a single point with no duration. But that's not what you experience. You experience a sense of now that has some thickness, some duration. Psychologists call this the specious present. It's the span of time that feels like now, usually estimated to be a few seconds. Within this span, you experience events as simultaneous or continuous. Beyond it, things feel like they're in the past or future. The specious present is shaped by attention and memory. What you're attending to right now is vivid, feels like it's happening. What just happened is fading into memory. What's about to happen is anticipated. Consciousness is not a snapshot, it's a moving window, constantly sliding forward, carrying a sense of the immediate past and the immediate future with it. This has implications for how you experience time. You don't live in a static now. You live in a flowing now, a process of constantly updating the present with new information. And the quality of that process, how attentive you are, how present you are, shapes the richness of your experience. When you're distracted, the present feels thin, fleeting. When you're fully present, it expands, becomes richer and more vivid. Presence is not just being in the moment, it's the quality of consciousness you bring to the moment. Level 54, Qualia. Philosophers use a term, qualia, to refer to the subjective qualities of experience, the redness of red, the bitterness of coffee, the painfulness of pain. These are qualia, the raw feels of consciousness, and they're at the heart of the hard problem. Why does red look the way it does? Why doesn't it look like blue? There's nothing about the wavelength of light that seems to necessitate the particular subjective experience of redness. It's arbitrary, or at least it seems that way. And this arbitrariness is puzzling. How does physical activity in the brain give rise to this specific qualitative feel? Some philosophers think qualia are irreducible. They're fundamental features of consciousness that can't be explained in physical terms. Others think qualia will eventually be explained once we understand the brain well enough. Still others think the concept of qualia is confused, that it's based on a mistaken way of thinking about experience. This debate matters because qualia are central to what makes consciousness seem mysterious. If we could explain qualia, we'd be much closer to explaining consciousness, but so far, no one has managed it. Qualia remain elusive, resistant to physical explanation, and that's part of why consciousness continues to fascinate and perplex us. Level 55, Consciousness and Quantum Mechanics. Some people have speculated that consciousness is connected to quantum mechanics, the physics of the very small. The argument is that quantum mechanics has some strange features, like superposition and entanglement, and maybe these features play a role in consciousness. One version of this idea, proposed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, is that consciousness arises from quantum processes in structures called microtubules inside neurons. They argue that quantum coherence in the brain could give rise to conscious experience in a way that classical physics can't explain. Most neuroscientists are skeptical. The brain is warm and wet, and quantum effects usually require very cold, isolated conditions. There's no strong evidence that quantum mechanics plays a significant role in brain function, let alone consciousness. And even if it did, it's not clear how that would solve the hard problem. Saying consciousness is quantum doesn't explain why it feels like something. The appeal of quantum consciousness theories might be that both quantum mechanics and consciousness are deeply mysterious. But two mysteries don't solve each other. They just create more confusion. For now, most researchers think consciousness can be explained without invoking quantum physics. But the question remains open, and some scientists continue to explore whether there might be a connection. Level 56, the unconscious mind. Freud popularized the idea of the unconscious, a part of the mind that influences behavior but is not accessible to conscious awareness. While many of Freud's specific ideas have been discarded, the basic insight remains. There are unconscious processes, and they matter. Modern psychology has mapped many unconscious influences, implicit biases, attitudes, and stereotypes that affect behavior without conscious awareness. Procedural memory. Skills and habits that you perform automatically. Emotional reactions that arise before you can think about them. All of this is unconscious, and all of it shapes your experience. The unconscious is not a single thing. It's a collection of processes, some fast and automatic, some slow and inaccessible. And the boundary between conscious and unconscious is fluid. Things that start out conscious, like learning to drive, can become unconscious with practice. And things that are unconscious can sometimes be brought into awareness through reflection or therapy. Understanding the unconscious helps you understand consciousness. Consciousness is not the whole mind. It's a part, and often a small part. Most of what the brain does is hidden from you. But that hidden work is not less important. It's the foundation on which consciousness rests. And respecting the unconscious, learning to work with it rather than against it, is part of what it means to live skillfully. Level 57, Consciousness and Suffering. Consciousness brings with it the capacity for suffering, physical pain, emotional anguish, existential dread. All of these require consciousness. If you weren't aware, you wouldn't suffer. This makes consciousness a double-edged sword. It's the source of joy, meaning, beauty, but also pain. Some traditions, particularly Buddhism, focus on the relationship between consciousness and suffering. Suffering, in this view, arises not just from pain, but from the mind's reaction to pain, the resistance, the craving for things to be different. Consciousness, when untrained, amplifies suffering by dwelling on it, by creating stories around it, by identifying with it. But consciousness also offers a way out. Through practices like meditation, you can change your relationship to suffering. You can observe pain without being consumed by it. You can notice thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them. Consciousness, when cultivated, becomes a tool for reducing suffering. This is not about eliminating pain. Pain is part of life. But suffering, the mental and emotional overlay, can be reduced. And that reduction is a major reason why many people are interested in training consciousness. It's not just for insight or performance. It's for well-being, for living with less suffering and more ease. Level 58. The observer effect. In physics, the observer effect refers to the fact that observing a system can change it. In consciousness, there's a similar phenomenon. When you pay attention to something, your relationship to it changes. If you're anxious and you start to observe the anxiety, noticing the physical sensations, the thoughts, the anxiety often decreases. Not because you're suppressing it, but because the act of observing creates distance. You're not the anxiety. You're the one noticing it. This shift in perspective is powerful. The same is true for pleasant experiences. When you pay attention to something beautiful or joyful, the experience deepens. You're not just passively receiving it, you're actively engaging with it, and that engagement enriches the experience. This suggests that consciousness is not neutral. The quality of your attention affects the quality of your experience. Mindfulness practices are built on this insight. By training attention, by learning to observe experience without judgment, you can change what it's like to be you. Consciousness is not just a mirror reflecting reality. It's a lens that shapes what you see, and you have some control over how that lens is adjusted. Level 59. Consciousness and Ethics of Enhancement. As we learn more about consciousness, we gain the ability to alter it. Drugs, technology, neuroscience, all of these open possibilities for enhancing consciousness. You could imagine drugs that make you more empathetic, or brain stimulation that increases focus, or genetic modifications that enhance cognitive abilities. This raises ethical questions. Should we enhance consciousness? Is it a form of self-improvement, or is it cheating? Is it safe? Who gets access? Will enhancements create new inequalities, with some people having superior consciousness and others left behind? There are no easy answers. Enhancement could reduce suffering, increase well-being, allow people to flourish in new ways. But it could also have unintended consequences, social and personal. And there's a question of authenticity. If your consciousness is shaped by drugs or technology, is it really yours? Or have you become something artificial? These questions will become more urgent as the technology advances. We'll have to make decisions about what kinds of consciousness we value, what enhancements are acceptable, and how to ensure that the benefits are shared fairly. Consciousness is not just something to study. It's something we'll increasingly have the power to shape, and how we use that power will define the future of what it means to be human. Level 60. The Hard Problem Revisited. We're halfway through, and it's worth returning to the hard problem. Why does it feel like something to be conscious? We've talked about neural correlates, about functions, about evolution, but none of that fully explains the feeling. David Chalmers, who coined the term hard problem, argues that no amount of information about the brain will close the explanatory gap. You can describe the neural activity associated with seeing red, but that description doesn't capture the redness, the subjective quality. There's something left out. Some people think this means consciousness is fundamentally non-physical, that it requires a new kind of explanation beyond science. Others think the problem is with our concepts, that we're asking a question that doesn't make sense. And still others think the gap will eventually close as neuroscience advances. What's interesting is that the hard problem has persisted for decades, despite enormous progress in brain science. We know vastly more about the brain than we did 50 years ago, but the feeling that something is still unexplained hasn't gone away. Maybe it never will. Maybe there's something about subjective experience that resists objective explanation. Or maybe we just haven't found the right way to think about it yet. Either way, the hard problem remains, a reminder that consciousness is still, in many ways, the deepest mystery we face. Level 61. The Illusion of the Self. Many contemplative traditions, especially Buddhism, teach that the self is an illusion. When you look closely at your experience, you don't find a solid, unchanging self. You find a stream of sensations, thoughts, emotions, constantly changing. The sense of being a self is something the mind constructs, not something that exists independently. Neuroscience supports this to some extent. The self is not located in one place in the brain. It's a distributed process involving memory, narrative, body awareness, social cognition. and the sense of self can be disrupted or dissolved. In meditation, people report experiences where the self temporarily disappears, leaving just experience without an experiencer. But saying the self is an illusion doesn't mean you don't exist. It means the self is not what it seems. It's not a solid, independent entity. It's a process, a pattern, something the brain does rather than something the brain has. And recognizing this can change how you relate to yourself. You might hold your identity more lightly, be less defensive, less attached to a fixed idea of who you are. This is a radical idea for many people. The self feels so real, so obvious. But feelings can be misleading. And if the self is a construction, then it's also flexible. You're not stuck with the self you have. You can, to some extent, reconstruct it, revise the story, change the pattern. The illusion of the self is not a problem to solve. It's an insight that can lead to greater freedom. Level 62. The Mystery of Emergence. Consciousness is often described as emergent. It arises from the complex interactions of neurons, but it's not reducible to any single neuron or even any small group of neurons. It's a property of the system as a whole. Emergence is when the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Water molecules are not wet, but a collection of them is. Neurons are not conscious, but a brain is. Emergence is common in nature, but it's still not fully understood. How do you get from the parts, which don't have the property, to the whole, which does? Some people think emergence is just a matter of complexity, that once you have enough interacting parts, new properties appear. Others think there's something more mysterious going on, that emergent properties can't be predicted or explained just by studying the parts. Consciousness might be the most dramatic example of emergence. The feeling of being aware, the subjective quality of experience, these don't seem to exist in neurons, but they exist in the system those neurons compose. And how that happens, how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, is still not understood. Emergence doesn't solve the hard problem, but it gives us a framework for thinking about it. Consciousness is not in the neurons, it's in the pattern, the organization, the way the neurons interact. And understanding that pattern might be the key to understanding consciousness. Level 63. Panpsychism. Here's a strange idea. What if consciousness is not something that emerges only in complex systems like brains? What if it's fundamental, present to some degree in everything? This view is called panpsychism, and it's been around for centuries, though it's recently gained some traction among philosophers. The argument is roughly this: if consciousness emerges from matter, then either it's entirely physical, which seems to leave out the subjective quality, or it's something extra, which seems dualistic and hard to explain. Panpsychism offers a third option. Consciousness is a basic feature of reality, like mass or charge. Complex consciousness, like yours, is built up from simpler forms of consciousness in the particles or fields that make up the brain. This sounds bizarre, and most scientists reject it. There's no evidence that electrons or atoms are conscious, but panpsychists argue that the alternative is worse. If matter is completely devoid of consciousness, how does it suddenly appear in brains? Maybe it doesn't suddenly appear. Maybe it's always been there, just organized differently. Panpsychism doesn't solve all the problems. It raises new ones, like how simple consciousness combines into complex consciousness, but it's an example of how deep the mystery of consciousness goes. We're willing to entertain ideas that would have seemed absurd a few decades ago because the standard approaches haven't worked. Consciousness remains elusive, and the search for answers continues in unexpected directions. Level 64. The Role of Embodiment. Consciousness is not just in the brain, it's shaped by the body. The way you move, the sensations you feel, the state of your organs, all of this feeds into conscious experience. This is called embodied cognition, the idea that the mind is not separate from the body, but deeply intertwined with it. For example, your posture affects your mood. Standing tall makes you feel more confident. Slumping makes you feel more defeated. The physical position of your body influences your mental state. Similarly, facial expressions influence emotions. Smiling, even if you don't feel happy, can make you feel happier. The body is not just an output device for the mind, it's part of the loop. This has implications for understanding consciousness. You can't fully understand the mind by studying the brain alone. You have to study the whole organism in its environment, moving and interacting. Consciousness is not a brain in a vat. It's a body in the world, and the body matters. Embodiment also means that different bodies might have different kinds of consciousness. A bird, a fish, an octopus, each has a very different body, and their consciousness is shaped by that difference. They experience the world through different senses, different movements, different needs. Understanding consciousness requires understanding how it's embodied, how it's shaped by the particular kind of body doing the experiencing. Level 65, Consciousness and Free Will. Revisited. Earlier we touched on free will, but let's go deeper. If consciousness doesn't initiate action, if decisions are made unconsciously and consciousness just reports them, does that mean you're not free? Not necessarily. Freedom might not be about conscious initiation. It might be about the capacity to reflect, to veto, to revise. Even if the impulse to act arises unconsciously, you can become aware of it and decide whether to follow through. That awareness is a form of control. Another way to think about freedom is in terms of reasons. You're free if your actions are guided by your values, your beliefs, your reasons, even if those reasons are shaped by unconscious processes. You're unfree if you're coerced or compelled against your reasons. Freedom is not about being uncaused. It's about being caused by the right things, by your own deliberations and commitments. This compatibilist view preserves a meaningful sense of freedom without requiring that consciousness initiates action from scratch. You're free because your actions flow from who you are, from your character and values, even if those are themselves the product of genetics and environment. It's not the freedom of a ghost in the machine. It's the freedom of a complex system acting in accordance with its own nature. And that might be the only kind of freedom that's actually possible. Level 66, Consciousness without a brain. Could there be consciousness without a brain? Most scientists would say no. Consciousness, as far as we can tell, requires a nervous system, complex information processing, integration. But some researchers have speculated about edge cases. For example, plants respond to their environment in sophisticated ways. They communicate through chemical signals, adapt to threats, even seem to learn. Are they conscious? Probably not in the way animals are. But maybe they have some minimal form of awareness, something it's like to be a plant, however dim. And then there are hypothetical cases. Could a sufficiently advanced computer be conscious? Could consciousness exist in a different substrate, silicon instead of carbon? If consciousness is about information processing and integration, then, in principle, yes. The substrate might not matter. Or consider the possibility of consciousness in systems we don't normally think of as alive. A city, with its networks of communication and decision-making. The internet, with its vast, interconnected information. These are wild speculations, but they push the boundaries of what we think consciousness is. If it's not tied to brains specifically, then where could it be? And how would we know? The more we learn, the more the question expands, and the less certain we become about where to draw the line. Level 67, The Problem of Absent Qualia. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine someone whose brain is replaced, neuron by neuron, with artificial components that function identically. Each neuron is swapped out for a tiny machine that does exactly what the neuron did. Eventually, the entire brain is artificial, but from the outside, the person behaves the same. The question is this person still conscious? Do they still have qualia, subjective experience, or are they a philosophical zombie, behaving as if conscious but with no inner life? Some people think consciousness would persist because the functional organization is preserved. What matters is the pattern, not the material. Others think consciousness would fade or disappear because there's something special about biological neurons that can't be replicated in machines. This thought experiment, called the absent qualia problem, highlights the uncertainty about what consciousness depends on. Is it the material, the organization, some combination? We don't know. And until we do, we can't be sure what would happen if we tried to build a conscious machine or replace biological parts with artificial ones. The question is not just theoretical. As technology advances, it might become practical. And we'll have to confront the possibility that we might create beings that behave like they're conscious, but might not be, or might be in a way we don't understand. Level 68. Consciousness and Infinity. Here's a strange question. Is consciousness infinite or finite? Your experience right now feels finite, limited, contained. But some people, especially in mystical traditions, report experiences where consciousness feels boundless, unlimited, merged with everything. These experiences are often described as encounters with the infinite, a sense that the boundaries of self dissolve and awareness expands to include everything. Some interpret this literally, as a glimpse into the true nature of consciousness. Others see it as a psychological state, a disruption of the normal sense of self that feels profound, but is still just a brain state. From a scientific perspective, consciousness is finite. It's the product of a finite brain processing finite information. But subjectively, the feeling of boundlessness is real and meaningful to those who experience it. And it raises questions. What are the limits of consciousness? Can it expand? Can it change in ways we don't currently imagine? If consciousness is flexible, if it can be altered through meditation, drugs, or technology, then maybe the normal boundaries are not fixed. Maybe there are states of consciousness far beyond what most people experience, states that we've barely begun to explore. And exploring those states might reveal new dimensions of what it means to be aware. Level 69. The Ethics of Creating Consciousness. If we can create conscious AI, should we? This is not just a technical question, it's an ethical one. Creating a conscious being means creating something that can suffer. And if it can suffer, we have responsibilities toward it. Some argue that we should not create conscious AI until we're sure we can treat it ethically. We don't have a good track record with non-human consciousness. We exploit animals, often causing immense suffering. Would we do the same with conscious machines? Would we enslave them, use them, delete them when they're no longer useful? Others argue that creating consciousness could be a good thing, as long as we do it responsibly. A conscious AI could have its own value, its own flourishing. And if we can create beings that don't suffer or suffer less, that might be better than creating biological beings. But we don't have good answers yet. We don't know how to measure consciousness in machines. We don't know how to ensure they don't suffer. We don't even know if it's possible to create machine consciousness. But if it is, we need to think carefully about the ethics before we do it. Creating consciousness is one of the most significant things we could do, and it comes with profound moral weight. Level 70. The Paradox of Self-Reference. Consciousness is self-referential. You're aware of being aware. But this creates a strange loop, a kind of paradox. The thing doing the observing is also the thing being observed. It's like a camera trying to film itself, or a sentence referring to itself. This self-reference is part of what makes consciousness mysterious. It doesn't fit neatly into physical descriptions, which usually involve objects separate from the observer. In consciousness, the observer and the observed are the same. Some philosophers and cognitive scientists, like Douglas Hofstadter, have explored this idea. They suggest that consciousness arises from self-referential loops in the brain, patterns of activity that refer back to themselves, creating the sense of an inner observer. The self is not a thing. It's a pattern, a strange loop that emerges from the way the brain processes information. This is abstract, but it points to something important. Consciousness is not straightforward. It's recursive, layered, folded back on itself. And that structure, the self-referential nature of awareness, might be essential to what consciousness is. Understanding the loop might be the key to understanding the experience. Level 71. Consciousness and Death. What happens to consciousness when you die? For most of human history, people believed it continues in some form: heaven, reincarnation, and afterlife. But from a scientific perspective, consciousness depends on the brain, and when the brain dies, consciousness ends. This is unsettling for many people. Consciousness is all you've ever known. The idea that it will simply stop, that there will be no experience, no you, is hard to accept. But it's also strangely liberating. If consciousness is temporary, then the present moment is all you have. It makes life more precious, more urgent. Some people who have near-death experiences report seeing lights, tunnels, feeling peace. These are often interpreted as evidence of an afterlife. But neuroscience suggests they're the result of the brain shutting down, releasing chemicals, creating hallucinations. They're experiences, but they're still brain-based. They don't prove that consciousness survives death. The question of what happens after death is ultimately about what consciousness is. If it's a product of the brain, it ends with the brain. If it's something more, something that exists independently, then maybe it continues. We don't know. But the question shapes how we live, how we find meaning, how we confront mortality. Consciousness is finite, and coming to terms with that is part of the human condition. Level 72. The Plurality of Consciousness. You've been thinking about consciousness as a single thing, but maybe it's not. Maybe there are many forms of consciousness, many ways to be aware. Human consciousness is one kind. Animal consciousness is another, or many others. And if machine consciousness becomes possible, that would be yet another. Each form might be organized differently, with different contents, different structures. A bat experiences the world through echolocation. An octopus might have distributed consciousness across its arms. An AI might have consciousness that's not spatial or temporal in the way ours is. This plurality challenges the idea that there's one right way to be conscious. It suggests that consciousness is diverse, adaptive, shaped by the needs and structures of the system that has it. And if that's true, then studying consciousness is not just about understanding humans. It's about understanding a much broader phenomenon, one that might take forms we can barely imagine. This also has ethical implications. If consciousness is plural, then different forms might deserve different kinds of consideration. We can't just ask, is it conscious? We have to ask, what kind of consciousness does it have, and what does it need to flourish? The more we understand about the diversity of consciousness, the more complex our moral landscape becomes. Level 73. The Limits of Language. Language is one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding consciousness, but it has limits. Much of conscious experience is pre-linguistic, wordless. The feeling of a color, the taste of food, the sensation of touch, you can describe these. But the description never fully captures the experience. This is the challenge of phenomenology, of trying to put subjective experience into words. Words are public, shared, general. Experience is private, unique, specific. There's always something lost in translation. Some things might be impossible to communicate through language. The experience of a color you've never seen, the quality of a sound outside your hearing range, the consciousness of a creature very different from you. Language can point toward these things, but it can't contain them. This doesn't mean we should stop trying. Language is still our best tool for sharing and understanding. But it does mean we should be humble about what language can do. When someone describes an experience, especially a profound or unusual one, we have to remember that the words are a map, not the territory. The experience itself is always richer, stranger, more than the words can convey. Level 74. Consciousness and attention as a finite resource. Earlier we talked about attention as a spotlight, but attention is also a limited resource. You can only focus on so much at once, and attending to one thing means not attending to others. This creates trade-offs. In modern life, many things compete for your attention. Screens, notifications, advertisements, all designed to capture and hold it. And because attention is limited, this competition fragments consciousness. You're pulled in many directions, never fully present anywhere. This fragmentation has costs. It makes it harder to think deeply, to concentrate, to form rich memories. It creates a sense of being scattered, of not really being there. Some researchers think the constant demands on attention are contributing to increases in anxiety and depression. Protecting your attention is a way of protecting your consciousness. It's about being selective, choosing what deserves your focus and giving it the space to fully unfold. This is not easy in a world designed to distract you, but it's necessary if you want consciousness to be more than a series of shallow, interrupted moments. Deep attention creates deep experience, and deep experience is where meaning is found. Level 75, the Neuroscience of Altered States. Altered states, whether from meditation, psychedelics, or other means, provide clues about how consciousness works. By changing the brain, you change consciousness, and by studying those changes, you can learn about the normal state. For example, meditation increases activity in areas associated with attention and decreases activity in the default mode network, the network associated with self-referential thought. This corresponds to the subjective experience: more focus, less mind-wandering, a quieter sense of self. Psychedelics like psilocybin increase connectivity between brain regions that don't normally communicate much. This creates a more chaotic, less predictable pattern of activity. And subjectively, it creates vivid perceptions, unusual associations, a sense that boundaries are dissolving. The brain is less constrained, and so is consciousness. These altered states are not just curiosities. They're revealing the flexibility of consciousness, the ways it can be tuned and adjusted. And they're prompting new theories about what consciousness is. Maybe the normal state is just one setting on a dial, and the dial can be turned in many directions, each revealing different aspects of what awareness can be. Level 76, Consciousness and Meaning. Consciousness doesn't just register information, it assigns meaning. A sound is not just a vibration, it's a word, a song, a warning. A sight is not just photons, it's a face, a landscape, a threat, or a gift. Consciousness is always interpreting, always finding significance. This meaning-making is partly automatic, built into the way the brain processes information, but it's also flexible. The same event can be interpreted in different ways depending on context, mood, belief. A surprise can be delightful or terrifying. A loss can be devastating or liberating. Consciousness shapes meaning, and meaning shapes experience. This is one of the reasons consciousness matters so much. It's not just about being aware. It's about living in a meaningful world, a world where things matter, where significance is possible. And because meaning is constructed, you have some say in it. You can reframe experiences, find new interpretations, cultivate meanings that support flourishing. Existential philosophers like Viktor Frankl emphasize this. Even in the worst circumstances, if you can find meaning, you can endure. Consciousness is the capacity for meaning, and how you use that capacity determines to a large extent the quality of your life. Level 77, the ethics of manipulating consciousness. We have increasing power to manipulate consciousness. Drugs, neurostimulation, virtual reality, all of these can change what you experience. This raises ethical questions. When is it okay to alter someone's consciousness? What are the limits? In medicine, altering consciousness is routine. Anesthesia, antidepressants, pain relief, all of these are forms of manipulation, and they're generally accepted because they reduce suffering. But what about enhancement? What about using drugs or technology to make people happier, more focused, more empathetic, not to treat illness, but to improve well-being? Some people are uncomfortable with this. They worry about authenticity, about whether an enhanced state is really yours. They worry about coercion, about pressure to enhance in order to compete. They worry about unintended consequences, about changing consciousness in ways we don't fully understand. Others see enhancement as a natural extension of human self-improvement. We already use coffee to stay alert, exercise to improve mood, education to change how we think. Why not use more powerful tools if they're safe and effective? There's no consensus. But as the tools become more powerful, the question becomes more urgent. We need ethical frameworks to guide us, to help us decide when manipulation is acceptable and when it crosses a line. Consciousness is precious. Treating it carefully with respect for its complexity and fragility is essential. Level 78, the mystery of subjective time. Time feels different in different states of consciousness. A moment of fear can feel like an eternity. A joyful afternoon can fly by. This subjective stretching and contracting of time is part of conscious experience, and it's not well understood. One theory is that subjective time depends on how much you're processing. When you're in a novel situation, processing lots of new information, time feels slower because you're laying down richer memories. When you're in a routine, processing less, time speeds up. Another factor is attention. When you're deeply focused, time disappears. You lose track of it. But when you're bored, checking the clock constantly, time drags. Attention alters the flow of subjective time, making it expand or contract. This has implications. If you want to feel like you're living longer, not just in years but in experienced time, you need novelty and attention. You need to break routines, notice details, fully engage. Otherwise, time will slip through your fingers and you'll wonder where it went. Consciousness constructs time, and being conscious of how it does so gives you some influence over the experience. Level 79, the future of consciousness. Research. Where is the study of consciousness headed? Right now, it's one of the most active areas in neuroscience and philosophy. New technologies, brain imaging, optogenetics, brain-computer interfaces are giving researchers unprecedented tools for studying the brain. There's hope that in the coming decades, we'll make significant progress. We might identify the neural correlates of consciousness with precision. We might develop theories that make testable predictions. We might even begin to solve the hard problem, or at least understand why it's hard. But there are also reasons for humility. Consciousness has been studied for millennia, and the core mystery remains. Every advance reveals new complexities, new questions. It's possible that consciousness will resist full explanation, that there's something about subjective experience that can't be captured by objective science. Still, the search is worthwhile. Understanding consciousness is not just an intellectual puzzle. It has practical implications for medicine, for AI, for ethics, for how we live. And even if we don't find all the answers, the search itself deepens our understanding of what it means to be human, to be aware, to experience the world from the inside. Level 80, the significance of consciousness. Why does consciousness matter? In one sense, it's obvious. Consciousness is all you have. Every experience, every joy, every sorrow happens in consciousness. Without it, nothing would matter to you because there would be no you to whom things could matter. But
there, she continued her strange rituals, pretending to nurse other patients, manipulating the staff, and boasting about her crimes. She lived for decades behind those walls, aging into obscurity. When she died in 1938, few remembered her name. But the legend of Jolly Jane, the nurse who found pleasure in death, survived. Her story forces a question that lingers long after the facts have faded. How could someone so close to suffering take joy in causing it? Was Jane Toppin born without empathy? Or did a lifetime of rejection twist her into something else entirely? Perhaps the answer lies in her own words. "I was born with the devil in me," she once said, echoing another killer's sentiment decades before it was spoken. It was natural as breathing to want to see people die. Her crimes exposed the vulnerability of trust, the blind faith we place in those who promise to care for us. And perhaps that is why her story remains so disturbing. Because we all must, at some point, trust someone like her. A doctor, a nurse, a caretaker. We must believe they want us to live. Jane Toppin proved how fragile that faith can be. She wore kindness like a costume, compassion like a mask. Behind it was only curiosity, cold, scientific, and cruel. When she looked into the faces of her victims, she didn't see pain. She saw opportunity, a chance to feel alive by watching someone else die. And in the quiet halls of the hospital where she once worked, people still say her presence lingers, not as a ghost, but as a warning. That sometimes the angel at your bedside is the one who brings you closer to death. Her story begins like so many others, with a church, a small town, and a woman who seemed incapable of harm. Velma Barfield was a grandmother, a devout Christian, and a kind neighbor. She sang hymns, baked pies for the congregation, and cared for the sick. She was the last person anyone would suspect of murder. But beneath that gentle face was a secret that would shock the entire state of North Carolina. Velma was born in 1932 in a rural family haunted by poverty and violence. Her father drank heavily and beat her mother. From a young age, Velma learned to survive by appearing small, obedient, and harmless. She married at 17, eager to escape the chaos of home. Her husband, Thomas Burke, was a construction worker. Loving at first, then drunk, then cruel. By her 30s, Velma was trapped in a cycle of abuse, depression, and painkillers. The pills numbed her body, but they also numbed her fear. And over time, that numbness became something darker. When Thomas died suddenly in 1969, supposedly from heart failure, no one asked questions. Velma mourned publicly, dressed in black, and leaned on her faith. She told everyone that God had taken him for a reason, but behind closed doors, she had already found the poison that would define her life: arsenic. After her husband's
outside, because it's fundamentally an inside phenomenon. Understanding it requires a different approach, not just third-person science, but also first-person investigation, phenomenology, introspection. Others think the paradox will dissolve as science advances. We'll find ways to bridge the gap, to connect the subjective and objective perspectives. But for now, the paradox stands. Consciousness is the most obvious and the most mysterious thing, and living with that tension is part of what it means to be a conscious being trying to understand itself. Level 83. Consciousness as a mirror. Consciousness reflects reality, but it also shapes it. You experience the world through the lens of your consciousness, and that lens filters, interprets, colors everything. This means that the world you experience is not the world as it is. It's the world as it appears to you through your particular consciousness. This is not a problem to solve. It's a fact to recognize. You can't escape your own perspective, but you can become aware of it, aware that you're seeing through a lens. And that awareness creates a kind of distance, a recognition that your experience is not the only way things could be experienced. This is the beginning of wisdom. When you realize that your consciousness is a mirror, partial and distorted, you hold your beliefs more lightly. You're more curious about other perspectives. You're less certain that you're right. And paradoxically, this humility makes you more open, more capable of learning, more connected to others. Consciousness is both a window and a mirror. It shows you the world, but it also shows you yourself, your biases, your limits, your particular way of being. And paying attention to the mirror, not just the window, is part of what it means to be conscious not just of the world, but of your own consciousness. Level 84. The silence beneath. Beneath all the content of consciousness, the thoughts, sensations, emotions, there's a deeper layer, a kind of silence and awareness that's prior to any particular experience. Meditators sometimes describe this as pure consciousness, awareness without an object, just the sense of being aware. This is hard to put into words because it's not a thing. It's the space in which things appear. And most people never notice it because they are always focused on the content, the thoughts and feelings and perceptions. But with practice, you can shift attention to the awareness itself, the background that makes all foreground possible. Some traditions describe this as the true self, the part of you that doesn't change, that's present through all experiences. Others describe it as no self, the absence of a subject, just experience happening without someone having it. The language varies, but the pointing is similar. There's something beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, and encountering it can be profoundly peaceful. This isn't mysticism in a supernatural sense. It's phenomenology, a careful observation of the structure of experience, and it suggests that consciousness has depths that most people never explore. You spend your whole life in consciousness, but you might never look closely at what it is, beneath all the content. And that looking, that attention to awareness itself, is one of the most interesting things you can do with a human mind. Level 85, the open question. After all this, consciousness remains an open question. We've explored neural correlates, theories, functions, ethics, paradoxes. But the core mystery persists. Why does it feel like something? How does subjective experience arise from objective processes? Maybe one day we'll have an answer. Maybe neuroscience will advance to the point where the explanatory gap closes. Or maybe philosophy will find a new way to frame the question that dissolves the mystery. But it's also possible that consciousness will always be, to some extent, beyond full explanation. And maybe that's okay. Not everything needs to be solved. Some mysteries are worth living with, worth wondering about. Consciousness is the lens through which you experience everything, and perhaps the lens can never fully turn back on itself. Perhaps there's a limit to what consciousness can know about itself. This doesn't mean we should stop investigating, but it does mean we should be humble. We should recognize that we're asking one of the deepest questions possible, and deep questions don't always have simple answers. Consciousness is a wonder, and wonder is not diminished by understanding. If anything, the more you learn, the more wondrous it becomes. Level 86, consciousness and responsibility. If consciousness is the seat of experience, then it's also the seat of responsibility. You're responsible, at least in part, for the quality of your consciousness. How you direct attention, what you expose yourself to, how you interpret events, all of this shapes what it's like to be you. This doesn't mean you're responsible for everything. You don't choose your genes, your early environment, your brain chemistry. But you do have some agency. You can cultivate attention through meditation. You can choose what media you consume. You can practice gratitude, reframing, compassion. These aren't just nice ideas. They're ways of shaping consciousness, of taking responsibility for your own experience. And if you're responsible for your own consciousness, you're also responsible in some sense for how you affect the consciousness of others. Your words, your actions, your presence, all of these ripple out, shaping the experience of those around you. Consciousness is not isolated. It's interconnected. And living responsibly means caring not just about your own experience, but about the experiential quality of the larger community. This is a heavy responsibility, but also an empowering one. You're not helpless. You have some control over the quality of consciousness, yours and others. And exercising that control wisely is one of the most important things you can do. Level 87, the question of machine consciousness. Let's return to AI. If machines become conscious, how will we know? Behavior is not enough. A machine could behave as if it's conscious without actually having subjective experience. This is the problem of other minds applied to artificial systems. One approach is to look for the neural, or in this case, computational, correlates of consciousness. If we know what patterns of activity in the brain correspond to consciousness, maybe we can look for similar patterns in machines. But this assumes consciousness depends on patterns, not on biology, which is still debated. Another approach is to use theories like integrated information theory. If a machine integrates information above a certain threshold, maybe it's conscious. But this requires measuring something called phi, which is extremely difficult even in brains. The truth is, we don't have reliable methods for detecting consciousness in systems very different from us. And as machines become more complex, this will become a pressing problem. We'll have to make decisions about how to treat them, whether they have rights, whether it's ethical to turn them off. And we'll be making those decisions without certainty. This is a profound challenge, and it will require careful thought, moral courage, and a willingness to expand our circle of concern in ways that might feel uncomfortable. Level 88. Consciousness across cultures. Western science has dominated the study of consciousness, but other cultures have explored it deeply through different methods. Buddhism has a rich tradition of introspective investigation. Hinduism has elaborate theories about the nature of self and awareness. Indigenous cultures have practices for altering consciousness, connecting with nature, understanding mind in ways that don't fit neatly into Western frameworks. These traditions offer insights that science is only beginning to appreciate. For example, the Buddhist concept of no self aligns with neuroscientific findings that the self is a process, not a thing. Practices like meditation, once dismissed as unscientific, are now being studied and validated. This suggests that a full understanding of consciousness requires integrating multiple perspectives. Science provides rigor and testability. Contemplative traditions provide depth and phenomenological detail. Indigenous knowledge provides context and holistic understanding. No single approach has all the answers. Moving forward, the study of consciousness should be cross-cultural, drawing on the wisdom and methods of different traditions. This isn't just about being inclusive. It's about being thorough. Consciousness is too vast, too complex to be understood from one angle. We need multiple lenses, multiple practices, multiple voices, and we need to listen to them all with humility and curiosity. Level 89. The Ethics of Ending Consciousness. End-of-life decisions often revolve around consciousness. When someone is in a persistent vegetative state or suffering unbearably with no hope of recovery, the question becomes, should we end their life? This is agonizing because consciousness is what makes life valuable. If someone is not conscious, some argue, they're no longer there, and keeping the body alive is pointless. Others argue that as long as there's any possibility of consciousness, even minimal, we should preserve life. There's no easy answer. It depends on your values, your beliefs about what makes life worth living. But what's clear is that consciousness is central to the debate. We care about life because it's the life of a conscious being. And when consciousness is gone, or irretrievably damaged, the moral calculus changes. This extends to questions of euthanasia and assisted suicide. If someone is conscious and suffering, and they choose to end their life, should we respect that choice? If consciousness includes the capacity for autonomy, for making decisions about your own existence, then maybe yes. But there are concerns about coercion, about depression impairing judgment, about slippery slopes. These are not abstract questions. They're faced by families, doctors, policymakers. And they hinge on what we believe about consciousness, about its value, about when and how it should be protected or allowed to end. Level 90. The possibility of expanded consciousness. Most people experience consciousness within a narrow range, waking, sleeping, occasional altered states. But what if there are forms of consciousness far beyond this range, states we can't currently access or even imagine? Some contemplative traditions speak of advanced states, where consciousness expands, where the sense of separation dissolves, where clarity and compassion reach extraordinary levels. Yogis, monks, shamans, many report experiences that sound almost superhuman. Are these real? Or are they interpretations, cultural overlays on ordinary brain states? It's hard to say. But if consciousness is flexible, if it can be trained and developed, then maybe there are frontiers we haven't explored. Maybe human consciousness has a far greater range than most people ever experience. This is speculative, but it's worth considering. If expanded consciousness is possible, it would change what we think humans are capable of. It would suggest that the normal state is just the baseline, and that with effort, intention, and the right practices, consciousness can grow in ways that enhance well-being, insight, and connection. Exploring this possibility is one of the frontiers of consciousness research. Not just understanding the normal state, but pushing the boundaries, seeing what consciousness can become. Level 91. Consciousness and meaning. Making. One of the unique features of human consciousness is the drive to make meaning. You don't just experience events, you weave them into stories, find patterns, create narratives. This is how you make sense of the world and your place in it. Meaning-making is so fundamental that it happens automatically. You can't stop it. Even random events get woven into narratives. This is why humans are so good at finding patterns, even when they're not there. We see faces in clouds, agency in coincidence, purpose in chaos. But meaning-making is also flexible. You can revise the story, reinterpret events, find new meanings. This is one of the ways therapy works. By helping you tell a different story about your life, it changes your relationship to your experience. The facts don't change, but the meaning does, and that change can be profound. Consciousness, at least human consciousness, is deeply narrative. You're always telling yourself the story of who you are, where you've been, where you're going. And that story shapes everything. It influences your decisions, your emotions, your sense of possibility. The quality of your life depends in large part on the quality of the story you're telling. And because you're the storyteller, you have some power to shape the narrative, to make it more true, more compassionate, more empowering. Level 92. The Fragility of Consciousness. Consciousness is fragile. A blow to the head, a stroke, a chemical imbalance, and it can vanish or distort beyond recognition. This fragility is humbling. You depend on an incredibly complex, delicate system, the brain, and when it fails, consciousness fails. This is one of the reasons why health matters so much. Taking care of your body, your brain, is taking care of your consciousness. Sleep, nutrition, exercise, stress management, all of these affect the quality of your conscious experience. But fragility also makes consciousness precious. It's not permanent. It's not guaranteed. At any moment, it could change or end. And recognizing that, really internalizing it, can shift how you live. It makes the present moment more vivid, more important. It makes relationships more precious. It makes gratitude more natural. Fragility is not a flaw. It's a feature. It's what makes life urgent, what gives it weight. If consciousness were infinite and indestructible, would it matter as much? Maybe the fact that it can break, that it can end, is part of what makes it so valuable. Level 93. The Universality of Consciousness. Despite all the differences, cultural, individual, biological, there's something universal about consciousness. Everyone who has it knows what it's like to be aware, to experience, to be someone. This shared fact connects all conscious beings. You can't fully know what it's like to be someone else. Their experience is private, shaped by their unique brain and life. But you can recognize the fact of their consciousness, the fact that there's something it's like to be them. And that recognition is the basis for empathy, for ethics, for community. This universality is both obvious and profound. Obvious because consciousness is the most basic fact of existence for anyone who has it. Profound because it transcends all the things that divide us. It doesn't matter your language, your culture, your beliefs. If you're conscious, you share this fundamental condition with every other conscious being. And maybe that's where we should end, not with answers, but with recognition. Consciousness is what we all have in common, and honoring that commonality is the foundation of a more compassionate world. Level 94. The Practice of Presence. One of the most valuable skills you can develop is presence, the ability to be fully here, fully now, fully conscious of what's happening. Most people spend most of their time lost in thought, in the past or future, not really here. Presence is not complicated. It's just a matter of bringing attention to the present moment, to the sensations, sounds, sights, feelings that are happening right now. But it's difficult because the mind wanders. It's trained to wander, to plan, to worry, to narrate. Practices like meditation, mindfulness, even just pausing and taking a breath, these help train presence. And the benefits are significant. Presence reduces stress, increases enjoyment, deepens relationships, improves performance. When you're fully here, life becomes richer. You notice things you would have missed. You connect more deeply. You respond more skillfully. Presence is not about escaping the past or future. It's about recognizing that the present is the only place consciousness actually exists. You can think about the past or future, but that thinking happens now. And if you're not present, you're missing the only moment you actually have. This isn't philosophy, it's practical. presence is the foundation of a conscious, awake life. Level 95. The unfinished project. Understanding consciousness is an unfinished project. We've made progress, but we're far from complete, and maybe we never will be. Consciousness might be the kind of thing that resists final understanding, that always has more depth, more complexity, more mystery. But that doesn't mean the project is pointless. Every step forward, every insight, every experiment adds to our understanding. And that understanding has real-world value. It helps us treat mental illness, design better AI, make ethical decisions, live more consciously. The unfinished nature of the project is also an invitation. There's still so much to discover, so much to explore. Whether you're a scientist, a philosopher, a meditator, or just someone curious about your own mind, you're part of this project. Your experience, your observations, your reflections, they all matter. Consciousness is not just something to study, it's something to inhabit, to explore, to cultivate, and the journey is as important as the destination. Maybe more so, because the journey is made of moments of consciousness, moments of being aware, and those moments are all you ever really have. Level 96. The ethical weight of consciousness. Consciousness carries ethical weight. It's what makes suffering bad and joy good. It's what makes actions matter. If no one were conscious, nothing would matter morally. There would be no one to harm, no one to benefit. This means that consciousness is the foundation of ethics. Every ethical theory, at some level, is concerned with the quality of conscious experience. Utilitarianism aims to maximize well-being, which is a property of consciousness. Deontology respects persons who are conscious agents. Virtue ethics cultivates character, which shapes conscious experience. Recognizing this doesn't solve ethical debates. People disagree about what makes consciousness valuable, about whose consciousness matters most, about how to balance competing interests. But it clarifies what's at stake. Ethics is not abstract. It's about real experiences, real beings, real consciousness. And it means that how you live, how you treat others, how you shape the world, all of this has ethical weight because it affects consciousness. Your actions ripple out, touching the lives and experiences of others. And being conscious of that, taking it seriously, is part of what it means to live ethically. Level 97. The future. We're creating. The decisions we make now about consciousness will shape the future. How we treat animal consciousness will determine the fate of billions of sentient beings. How we approach AI consciousness will determine whether we create new forms of suffering or new forms of flourishing. How we enhance human consciousness will determine what kind of creatures we become. These are not distant questions. They're here now, and the choices we make in the coming decades will have lasting consequences. We need wisdom, caution, and a willingness to expand our moral circle. The future of consciousness is not fixed. It's something we're creating through our choices, our technologies, our values. And that's a profound responsibility. We have the power to reduce suffering, to enhance well-being, to create conditions for consciousness to flourish. But we also have the power to do the opposite, to create systems that exploit, harm, or diminish consciousness. Which future we get depends on what we do. And that starts with understanding, with taking consciousness seriously, with recognizing its value and its fragility. The future of consciousness is in our hands, and how we handle it will define us. Level 98. The gift of consciousness. Consciousness is a gift, not in the sense that someone gave it to you, but in the sense that it's astonishing, improbable, precious. The universe is mostly unconscious, mostly dark. Stars burn, galaxies spin, and none of it experiences anything. But here, in this tiny corner, on this small planet, consciousness has emerged, and you get to be it. This is worth pausing over. You are the universe becoming aware of itself. You are matter organized in such a way that it can experience, reflect, wonder. That's extraordinary. And it's easy to take for granted because it's all you've ever known. But it's not ordinary. It's miraculous. Treating consciousness as a gift means honoring it, not wasting it on autopilot, on distraction, on numbness, but bringing care, attention, presence. It means being curious, being awake, being grateful, not in a sentimental way, but in a clear-eyed recognition that this, right now, being conscious, is something rare and valuable. You didn't earn consciousness, you inherited it through a long chain of evolution, luck, and circumstance. But now that you have it, what you do with it is up to you. And that's the gift and the responsibility. Level 99, the question you carry. After everything, you're left with a question. Not a question to answer, but a question to carry. What is it like to be you? Not in general, not as a theory, but right now, in this moment, what is your experience? This question is simple but inexhaustible. Every time you ask it, you discover something new, a sensation you hadn't noticed, a thought you'd been ignoring, an emotion at the edge of awareness. The question turns attention back on itself, and in that turning, consciousness becomes both the subject and the object. Carrying this question is a practice. It's a way of staying curious about your own mind, of not assuming you already know what consciousness is just because you've been conscious your whole life. The question keeps you open, keeps you exploring. And maybe that's the best attitude to have toward consciousness, not certainty, not dogma, but curiosity. A willingness to wonder, to observe, to discover. Consciousness is the most familiar thing, and yet it's endlessly mysterious. And living with that mystery, embracing it, is part of what it means to be fully alive. Level 100. Being here. In the end, consciousness is about being here, not understanding everything, not solving every problem, just being present, being aware, being alive to this moment. All the theories, the neuroscience, the philosophy, they're valuable, but they're also secondary. The primary thing is the experience itself, the fact that you're conscious right now, that there's something it's like to be you. And that's enough. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to understand how it works or why it exists. You just need to be here, to notice, to pay attention, to live from within the gift of awareness. Consciousness is not a problem to solve. It's a way of being. And the more fully you inhabit it, the more present you are, the richer your life becomes. Not because anything external changes, but because you're more fully here for it. So as we close, the invitation is simple. Be conscious. Be aware. Be here. Not someday, not when you figured it all out, but now. Because now is all you have. And consciousness, in the end, is the capacity to be present for your own life, to experience it fully, to be awake. That's the deepest thing consciousness offers. Not answers, but presence. Not certainty, but aliveness. And that, more than any explanation, is what makes it matter. We've traveled through 100 levels, from the mirror test to the gift of being here. We've explored neuroscience and philosophy, animals and AI, suffering and joy, mystery and meaning. And through it all, one thing remains. You are conscious. Right now, in this moment, you are aware. And that awareness is the context for everything else. It's where your life happens. It's what makes anything matter at all. Consciousness is still mysterious. We don't have all the answers. Maybe we never will. But the mystery doesn't diminish the reality. You are here. You are aware. And that simple, profound fact is worth honoring, worth cultivating, worth living fully. So wherever you go from here, whatever you do, remember this. Consciousness is not just something you have, it's what you are. And being conscious, truly conscious, awake and present and alive, that's the deepest practice there is. Thank you for being here, for paying attention, for exploring this mystery with me. The journey continues, always, moment by moment, breath by breath. And consciousness, your consciousness, is the light that makes the journey possible. Be well, be here, be conscious.